News by Joseph Jacobs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. News. Mr. G.
Ha, Steward. How are you, my old boy? How do things go on at home?
Steward. Bad enough, Your Honour. The magpie's dead.
Poor Mag. So he is gone. How came he to die?
Overate himself, sir.
Did he indeed? A greedy dog. Why, what did he get that he liked so well?
Horseflesh. He died of eating horseflesh.
How came he to get so much horseflesh?
All your father's horses, sir.
What? Are they dead too?
Aye, sir. They died of overwork.
And why were they overworked?
To carry water, sir.
To carry water? And what were they carrying water for?
Sure, sir, to put out the fire.
Fire? What fire?
Your father's house is burned down to the ground.
My father's house burned down? And how came it to be on fire?
I think, sir, it must have been the torches.
Torches? What torches?
At your mother's funeral.
My mother dead?
Aye, poor lady. She never looked up after it.
After what?
The loss of your father.
My father gone too?
Yes, poor gentleman. He took to his bed as soon as he heard of it.
Heard of what?
The bad news. And it please, Your Honour.
What? More miseries, more bad news.
Yes, sir. Your bank has failed, your credit is lost, and you're not worth a single shilling in the world. I made bold, sir, to come and wait on you about it, for I thought you would like to hear the news. End of News by Joseph Jacobs, read by Francis Brown, www.francislv.wordpress.com.
How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content.
The Sagacious Monkey and the Boar in Japanese Fairy Tales by Yei Theodora Ozaki. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Long, long ago, there lived in the province of Shinshin in Japan a traveling monkey man who earned his living by taking round a monkey and showing off the animal's tricks. One evening the man came home in a very bad temper and told his wife to send for the butcher the next morning. The wife was very bewildered and asked her husband, "Why do you wish me to send for the butcher?" "It's no use taking that monkey round any longer. He's too old and he forgets his tricks. I beat him with my stick all I know how, but he won't dance properly. I must now sell him to the butcher and make what money out of him I can. There's nothing else to be done." The woman felt very sorry for the poor little animal and pleaded for her husband to spare the monkey. But her pleading was in vain. The man was determined to sell him to the butcher. Now the monkey was in the next room and overheard every word of the conversation. He soon understood that he was to be killed, and he said to himself, "Barbarous indeed is my master. Here I have served him faithfully for years, and instead of allowing me to end my days comfortably and in peace, he's going to let me be cut up by the butcher, and my poor body is to be roasted and stewed and eaten. Woe is me! What am I to do? A bright thought has struck me. There is, I know, a wild boar living in the forest nearby. I have often heard tell of his wisdom. Perhaps if I go to him and tell him the strait I am in, he will give me counsel. I will go and try." There was no time to lose. The monkey slipped out of the house and ran as quickly as he could to the forest to find the boar. The boar was at home, and the monkey began his tale of woe at once. "Good Mr. Boar, I have heard of your excellent wisdom. I am in great trouble. You alone can help me. I have grown old in the service of my master, and because I cannot dance properly now, he intends to sell me to the butcher. What do you advise me to do? I know how clever you are." The boar was pleased at the flattery, and determined to help the monkey. He thought for a little while, and then said, "Hasn't your master a baby?" "Oh, yes," said the monkey. "He has one infant son." "Doesn't it lie by the door in the morning when your mistress begins the work of the day? Well, I will come around early, and when I see my opportunity, I will seize the child and run off with it." "What then?" said the monkey. "Why, the mother will be in a tremendous scare, and before your master and mistress know what to do, you must run after me and rescue the child, and take it home safely to its parents, and you will see when the butcher comes, they won't have the heart to sell you." The monkey thanked the boar many times, and then went home. He did not sleep much that night, as you may imagine, for thinking of the morrow. His life depended on whether the boar's plan succeeded or not. He was the first up, waiting anxiously for what was to happen. It seemed to him a very long time before his master's wife began to move about and open the shutters to let in the light of day. Then all happened as the boar had planned. The mother placed her child near the porch as usual, while she tidied up the house and got her breakfast ready. The child was crooning happily in the morning sunlight, dabbing on the mats at the play of light and shadow. Suddenly there was a noise in the porch, and a loud cry from the child. The mother ran out from the kitchen to the spot, only just in time to see the boar disappearing through the gate, with her child in its clutch. She flung out her hands with a loud cry of despair, and rushed into the inner room where her husband was still sleeping soundly. He sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes, and crossly demanded what his wife was making all that noise about. By the time the man was alive to what had happened, and they both got outside the gate, the boar had got well away. But they saw the monkey running after the thief as hard as his legs would carry him. Both the man and wife were moved to admiration at the plucky conduct of the sagacious monkey, and their gratitude knew no bounds when the faithful monkey brought the child safely back to their arms. "There," said the wife, "this is the animal you want to kill. If the monkey hadn't been here, we should have lost our child forever." "You are right, wife, for once," said the man, as he carried the child into the house. "You may send the butcher back when he comes. And now give us all a good breakfast, and the monkey too." When the butcher arrived, he was sent away with an order for some boar's meat for the evening dinner. And the monkey was petted and lived the rest of his days in peace, nor did his master ever strike him again. End of The Sagacious Monkey and the Boar, in Japanese Fairy Tales, by Yei Theodora Ozaki.
The Wolf and the Seven Little Goats, by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wolf and the Seven Little Goats. There was once an old goat who had 7 little ones, and was as fond of them as ever mother was of her children. One day she had to go into the wood to fetch food for them, so she called them all around her. "Dear children," said she, "I am going into the wood, and while I am gone, be on your guard against the wolf. For if he were once to get inside, he would eat you up, skin, bones, and all. The wretch often disguises himself, but he may always be known by his hoarse voice and black paws. "Dear mother," answered the kids, "you need not be afraid. We will take good care of ourselves." And the mother bleated goodbye and went on her way with an easy mind. It was not long before someone came knocking at the house door and crying out, "Open the door, my dear children. Your mother has come back and has brought each of you something." But the kids knew it was the wolf by the hoarse voice. "We will not open the door," cried they. "You are not our mother. She has a delicate and sweet voice, and your voice is hoarse. You must be the wolf." Then off went the wolf to a shop and bought a big lump of chalk and ate it up to make his voice soft. And then he came back, knocked at the house door, and cried, "Open the door, my dear children. Your mother is here and has brought each of you something." But the wolf had put up his black paws against the window, and the kids, seeing this, cried out, "We will not open the door. Our mother has no black paws like you. You must be the wolf." The wolf then ran to the baker. "Baker," said he, "I am hurt in the foot. Pray spread some dough over the place." And when the baker had plastered his feet, he ran to the miller. "Miller," said he, "strew me some white meal over my paws." But the miller refused, thinking the wolf must be meaning harm to someone. "If you don't do it," cried the wolf, "I'll eat you up." And the miller was afraid and did as he was told. And that just shows what men are. And now came the rogue the third time to the door and knocked. "Open, children," cried he. "Your dear mother has come home and brought each of you something from the wood." "First, show us your paws," said the kids, "so that we may know if you are really our mother or not." And he put up his paws against the window. And when they saw that they were white, all seemed right, and they opened the door. And when he was inside, they saw it was the wolf, and they were terrified and tried to hide themselves. One ran under the table, the second got into bed, and the third into the oven, the fourth in the kitchen, the fifth in the cupboard, and the sixth under the sink, the seventh in the clock case. But the wolf found them all, and gave them short shrift. One after the other he swallowed down, all but the youngest, who was hid in the clock case. And so the wolf, having got what he wanted, strolled forth into the green meadows, and laying himself under a tree, he fell asleep. Not long after, the mother goat came back from the wood, and oh, what a sight met her eyes! The door was standing wide open, table, chairs, and stools all thrown about, dishes broken, quilt and pillows torn off the bed. She sought her children. They were nowhere to be found. She called to each of them by name, but nobody answered until she came to the name of the youngest. "Here I am, mother," a little voice cried, "here in the clock case." And so she helped him out, and heard how the wolf had come and eaten all the rest. And you may think how she cried for the loss of her dear children. At last in her grief she wandered out of doors, and the youngest kid with her. And when they came into the meadow, there they saw the wolf lying under a tree, and snoring so that the branches shook. The mother goat looked at him carefully on all sides, and she noticed how something inside his body was moving and struggling. "Dear me," thought she, "can it be that my poor children that he devoured for his evening meal are still alive?" And she sent the little kid back to the house for a pair of shears and needle and thread. Then she cut the wolf's body open, and no sooner had she made one snip that out came the head of one of the kids, and then another snip, and then one after the other. The 6 little kids all jumped out alive and well, for in his greediness the rogue had swallowed them down whole. How delightful this was! So they comforted their dear mother, and hopped about like tailors at a wedding. "Now fetch some good hard stones," said the mother, "and we will fill his body with them as he lies asleep." And so they fetched some in haste, and put them inside him, and the mother sewed him up so quickly again that he was none the wiser. When the wolf at last awoke, and got up, the stones inside him made him feel very thirsty. And as he was going to the brook to drink, they struck and rattled one against another. And so he cried out, "What is this I feel inside me, knocking hard against my bones? How should such a thing betide me? They were kids, and now they're stones." So he came to the brook and stooped to drink, but the heavy stones weighed him down, so he fell over into the water and was drowned. And when the 7 little kids saw it, they came up running. "The wolf is dead, the wolf is dead," they cried, and taking hands, they danced with their mother all about the place. End of The Wolf and the 7 Little Goats by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm.
The Little Red Hen, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie, Edward Everett Hale, and William Byron Forbush. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Little Red Hen. Little Red Hen found a grain of wheat. "Who will plant this?" she asked. "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said the Little Red Hen. So she buried the wheat in the ground. After a while it grew up yellow and ripe. "The wheat is ripe now," said the Little Red Hen. "Who will cut and thresh it now?" "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said the Little Red Hen. So she cut it with her bill and threshed it with her wings. Then she asked, "Who will take this wheat to the mill?" "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said the Little Red Hen. So she took the wheat to the mill, where it was ground. Then she carried the flour home. "Then who will make me some bread with this flour?" she asked. "Not I," said the cat. "Not I," said the goose. "Not I," said the rat. "Then I will," said the Little Red Hen. So she made and baked the bread. Then she said, "Now we shall see who will eat the bread." "We will," said cat, goose, and rat. "I'm quite sure you would," said the Little Red Hen, "if you could get it." Then she called her chicks, and they ate up all the bread. There was none left for the cat, or the goose, or the rat. End of The Little Red Hen, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie, Edward Everett Hale, and William Byron Forbush.
Wishbone Valley by R.K. McKittrick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Armentrout. A Thanksgiving ghost story about a boy who dined not wisely, but too well. The Thanksgiving feast had just ended, and only Donald and his little sister Grace remained at the table, looking drowsily at the plum pudding that they couldn't finish, but which they disliked to leave on their plates. When the plates had been removed, and the plum pudding taken to the kitchen and placed beside the well-carved gobbler, Donald and Grace were too tired to rise from their chairs to have their faces washed. They seemed lost in a roseate repose, until Grace finally thought of the wishbone that they intended to break after dinner. "Come now, Donald," she said, "let's break the old gobbler's wishbone." "All right," replied Donald, opening his eyes slowly and unwrapping the draperies of his sweet plum pudding dreams from about him. "Let's do it now." So he held up the wishbone, and Grace took hold of the other end of it with a merry laugh. "Here, you must not take hold so far from the end, because I have a fine wish to make and want to get the big half if possible." "So have I a nice wish to make," replied Grace with a sigh, "and I also want the big end." And so they argued for a few minutes, until their mother entered the room and told them that if they could not stop quarreling over the wishbone, she would take it from them and throw it into the fire. So they lost no time in taking it by the ends and snapping it asunder. "Hurrah!" exclaimed Donald, observing Grace's expression of disappointment. "I've got it." "Well, I've made a wish too," said Grace. "But it won't come true," replied Donald, "because you have the little end." And then Donald thought he would go out in the air and play, because his great dinner made him feel very uncomfortable. When he was out in the barnyard, it was just growing dusk, and Donald, through his half-closed eyes, observed a gobbler strutting about. To his great surprise, The gobbler approached him instead of running away. "I thought we had you for dinner today," said Donald. "You did," replied the gobbler coldly, "and you had a fine old time, didn't you?" "Yes," said Donald. "You made a splendid dinner, and you ought to be pleased to think you made us all so happy. Your second joints were very sweet and juicy, and your drumsticks were like sticks of candy." "And you broke my poor old wishbone with your little sister, didn't you?" "I did." "And what did you wish?" asked the gobbler. "You mustn't ask me that," replied Donald, "because, you know, if I tell you the wish I made, it would not come true." "But it was my wishbone," persisted the gobbler, "and I think I ought to know something about it." "You have rights, I suppose, and your argument is not without force," replied Donald with calm dignity. The gobbler was puzzled at so lofty a reply, and not understanding it, said, "I am only the ghost or spirit of the gobbler you ate today. But still I remember how one day last summer you threw a pan of water on me, and alluded to my wattles as a red necktie, and called me Old Harvard. Now, come along." "Where?" asked Donald. "To Wishbone Valley, where you will see the spirits of my ancestors eaten by your family." It was now dusk, and Donald didn't like the idea of going to such a place. He was a brave, courageous boy on most occasions, but the idea of going to Wishbone Valley, when the stars were appearing, filled him with a dread that he didn't like to acknowledge, even to the ghost of a gobbler. "I can't go with you now, Mr. Gobbler," he said, "because I have a lot of lessons to study for next Monday. Wait until tomorrow, and I will gladly go with you." "Come along," replied the gobbler with a provoked air, "and let your lessons go until tomorrow, when you have plenty of light." Thereupon the gobbler extended his wing and took Donald by the hand and started on a trot. "Not so fast," protested Donald. "Why not?" demanded the gobbler in surprise. "Because," replied Donald with a groan, "I have just had my dinner, and I am too full of you to run." So the gobbler kindly and considerately slackened his pace to a walk, and the two proceeded out of the barnyard and across a wide meadow to a little valley surrounded by a dense thicket. The moon was just rising, and the thicket was silvered by its light, while the dry leaves rustled weirdly in the cold, crisp air. "This," said the gobbler, "is Wishbone Valley. Look and see." Donald strained his eyes, and sure enough, there were wishbones sticking out of the ground in every direction. He thought they looked like little croquet hoops, but he made no comments, for fear of offending the old gobbler. But he felt that he must say something to make the gobbler think that he was not frightened, so he remarked in an offhand way, "Let's break one and make a wish." The ghost of the old gobbler frowned, drew himself up, and uttered a ghostly whistle that seemed to cut the air. As he did so, the ghost of the other turkeys, long since eaten, popped out of the thickets with a great flapping of wings, and each one perched upon a wishbone and gazed upon poor Donald, who was so frightened that his collar flew into a standing position while he stood upon his toes with his knees knocking together at a great rate. Every turkey fixed its eyes upon the trembling boy, who was beside himself with fear. "What shall we do with him, Grandpapa?" asked the gobbler of an ancient bird that could scarcely contain itself and remain on its wishbone. "I cannot think of anything terrible enough, Willie," replied the grandparent. "It almost makes my ghost ship boil when I think of the way in which he used to amuse himself by making me a target for his bean shooter. Often when I was asleep in the button ball, he would fetch me one on the side of the head that would give me an earache for a week. But now it is our turn." Here the other turkeys broke into a wild chorus of approval. "Take his bean sugar from his pocket," suggested another bird, "and let's have a shot at him." Donald was compelled to hand out his bean shooter, and the grandparent took it, lay on his back, and with the handle of the bean shooter in one claw and the missile end in the other, began to send pebbles at Donald at a great rate. He could hear them whistling past his ears, but could not see them to dodge. Fortunately, none struck him, and when the turkeys felt that they had had fun enough of that kind at his expense, the bean shooter was returned to him. "Now then," said the gobbler's Aunt Fanny, "he once gave me a string of yellow beads for corn." "What shall we do to him for that?" asked the gobbler. "Make him eat a lot of yellow beads," said the chorus. "But we have no beads," said the gobbler sadly. "Then let's poke him with the stick," suggested the gobbler's grand-uncle Sylvester. "He used to do that to us." So they all took up their wishbones and poked Donald until he was sore. Sometimes they would hit him in a ticklish spot and throw him into such a fit of laughter that they thought he was enjoying it all and chaffing them. So they stuck their wishbones into the ground and took their positions on them once more to take a needed rest, for the poor ghosts were greatly exhausted. There was one quiet turkey who had taken no part in the proceedings. "Why don't you suggest something?" demanded Uncle Sylvester. "Because," replied the quiet turkey, "Donald never did anything to me, and I must treat him accordingly. I was raised and killed a long way from here and canned. Donald's father bought me at a store. To be a ghost in good standing, I should be on the farm where I was killed, and really I don't know why I should be here." "Then you should be an impartial judge," said Aunt Fanny. "Now, what shall we do with him?" "Tell them to let me go home," protested Donald, "and I'll agree never to molest or eat turkey again. I will give them all the angleworms I can dig every day, and on Thanksgiving Day I'll ask my father to have roast beef." "I think," replied the impartial canned ghost, "that as all boys delight in chasing turkeys with sticks, it would be eminently just and proper for us, with the exception of myself, to chase this boy and beat him with our wishbones, to let him learn by experience that which he could scarcely learn by observation." "What could I do but eat turkey when it was put on the table?" protested Donald. "But you could help chasing us around with sticks," sang the chorus. They thereupon descended from the wishbones upon which they had been perching, and flying after him, they darted the wishbones, which they held in their beaks, into his back and neck as hard as they could. Donald ran up and down Wishbone Valley, calling upon them to stop, and declaring that if turkey should ever be put upon the table again, he would eat nothing but the stuffing. When Donald found that the wishbones were sticking into his neck, like so many hornet stings, he made up his mind that he would run for the house. Finally, the wishbone tattoo stopped, and when he looked around, the gobbler, who was 20 feet away, said, when a Thanksgiving turkey dies, his ghost comes down here to Wishbone Valley to join his ancestors, and it never after leaves the valley. You will now know why every spring the turkeys steal down here to hatch their little ones. As you are now over the boundary line, you are safe." "Thank you," said Donald gratefully. "Goodbye," sang all the ghosts in chorus. There was then a great ghostly flapping and whistling, and the turkeys and wishbones all vanished from sight. Donald ran home as fast as his trembling legs could carry him, and he fancied that the surviving turkeys on the place made fun of him as he passed on his way. When he reached the house, he was very happy, but made no allusion to his experience in Wishbone Valley, for fear of being laughed at. "Come, Donald," said his mother shortly after his arrival. "It is almost bedtime. You had better eat that drumstick and retire." "I think I have had turkey enough for today," replied Donald with a shudder. "And if it is just the same, I would rather have a nice thick piece of pumpkin pie." So the girl placed a large piece of pie before him, and while he was eating with the keen appetite given him by the crisp air of Wishbone Valley, he heard a great clattering of hoofs coming down the road. These sounds did not stop until the express wagon drew up in front of the house, and the driver brought in a large package for Donald. "Hurrah!" shouted Donald in boundless glee. "Uncle Arthur has sent me a nice bicycle. Wasn't it good of him?" "Didn't you wish for a bicycle today, when you got the big end of the wishbone?" asked his little sister Grace. "What makes you think so?" asked Donald with a laugh. "Oh, I knew it all the time. And my wish came true, too." "How could your wish come true?" asked Donald with a puzzled look, "when you got the little half of the wishbone?" "I don't know," replied Grace, "but my wish did come true." "And what did you wish?" "Why," said Grace, running up and kissing her little brother affectionately, "I wished your wish would come true, of course." End of Wishbone Valley by R.K. McKittrick.
The Little Red House by C.J. Dennis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Very few grown-up people understand houses. Only children understand them properly. And, if I understand them just a little, it is because I knew Sim. Sim and his wife, Emily Ann, lived in the Little Red House. It was built on a rather big mountain, and there were no other houses near it. At one time, long ago, the mountain had been covered all over with a great forest, but men had cut the trees down, all but one big blue gum, which grew near the Little Red House. The blue gum and the Little Red House were great friends, and often had long talks together. The blue gum was a very old tree, over 100 years old, and he was proud of it, and often used to tell of the time, long ago, when blackfellows hunted possums in his branches. That was before the white men came to the mountain, and before there were any houses near it. Once upon a time I put a verse about the mountain and the Little Red House into a book of rhymes which I wrote for grown-ups. I don't think they thought much about it. Very likely they said, "Oh, it's just a house on a hill," and then forgot it, because they were too busy about other things. This is the rhyme. A great mother mountain and kindly is she, who nurses young rivers and sends them to sea, and nestled high up on her sheltering lap is a little red house with a little straw cap, that bears a blue feather of smoke curling high, and a bunch of red roses cocked over one eye. I have tried here to draw the Little Red House for you as well as I can, and it isn't my fault if it happens to look just a little like somebody's face. I can't help it, can I, if the stones of the doorstep look something like teeth, or if the climbing roses make the windows look like a funny pair of spectacles. And if Emily Ann will hang big fluffy bobs on the window blinds for tassels, and if they swing about in the breeze like moving eyes, well, I am not to blame, am I? It just happens. The only thing I am sorry for is that I couldn't get the big blue gum into the picture. Of course I could have drawn it quite easily, but it was too big. Sim and Emily Ann were fond of the Little Red House, and you may be sure the Little Red House was fond of them. He was their home. The only thing that bothered him was that they were sometimes away from home, and then he was miserable, like all empty houses. Now Sim was a tinker, a travelling tinker. He would do a little gardening and farming at home for a while, and then go off about the country for a few days, mending people's pots and pans and kettles. Usually Sim left Emily Ann at home to keep the Little Red House company, but now and then Emily Ann went with Sim for a trip, and then the Little Red House was very sad indeed. One morning, just as the sun was peeping over the edge of the world, the big blue gum woke up and stretched his limbs, and waited for the Little Red House to say, "Good morning." The blue gum always waited for the greeting because he was the older, and he liked to have the proper respect shown to him by young folk. But the Little Red House didn't say a word. The big blue gum waited and waited, but the Little Red House wouldn't speak. After a while the blue gum said rather crossly, "You seem to be out of sorts this morning." But the Little Red House wouldn't say a word. "You certainly do seem as if you had a pain somewhere," said the blue gum. "And you look funny. You ought to see yourself." "Indeed?" snapped the Little Red House, raising his eyebrows just as a puff of wind went by. "I can't always be playing the fool like some people." "I've lived on this mountain, tree and sapling, for over 100 years," replied the big blue gum very severely, "and never before have I been treated with such disrespect. When trees become houses, they seem to lose their manners." "Forgive me," cried the Little Red House. "I didn't mean to be rude. I was just listening. There are things going on inside me that I don't like." "I hope they aren't ill-treating you," said the blue gum. "They are going to leave me," sighed the Little Red House. "And they are laughing quite happily, as if they were glad about it. There's a nice thing for you, going to leave me and laughing about it." "But perhaps you are wrong," said the big blue gum, who was not so hard-hearted as he seemed. "I always know," moaned the Little Red House. "I can't be mistaken. Sim was singing his tinker's song this morning long before the sun was up, and I heard him tell Emily Ann not to forget her umbrella. That means she is going, and the little dog is going, and I shall be all alone." "Well," answered the blue gum rather stiffly, "you still have me for company." "I know," sighed the Little Red House. "Don't think I'm ungrateful. But when they both go away, I shan't be really and truly a home again until they come back. Just an empty house, and it makes me miserable. How would you like to be an empty house?" "Some day I might be," replied the blue gum, "if I don't grow too old. There is some fine timber in me yet." Suddenly there was a great clattering and stamping inside the little house, and Sim began to sing his tinker's song. "Kettles and pans, all the broad earth is the tinkering man's. The green leafy lane or the fields are his home, the road or the river where'er he roam. He roves for a living and rest where he can, then bring out your kettle, ho, kettle or pan." "There's a nice thing for you," said the Little Red House bitterly. "What kind of song do you call that? Any old place is good enough for his home, and I am just nothing." "Oh, that's only his way of putting it," answered the blue gum kindly. "He doesn't really mean it, you know. He wants a change, that's all." But the Little Red House wouldn't say a word. "It looks a good deal like rain this morning, doesn't it?" said the blue gum cheerfully, trying to change the subject. But the Little Red House wouldn't say a word. Very soon Sim and Emily Ann, carrying bundles, came out of the Little Red House, laughing and talking, and Sim locked the door. "Now for a jolly trip," shouted Sim, as he picked up his firepot and soldering irons. But all at once Emily Ann ceased laughing, and looked back wistfully at the Little Red House. "After all, I'm sorry to leave our little home," she said. See how sad it looks." "Hurry on," cried Sim, who was all eagerness for the trip. Then he too looked back. "Why, you forgot to draw down the blinds," he said. "No, I didn't forget," answered Emily Ann, "but I think it a shame to blindfold the Little Red House while we were away. I just left the blinds up so that he could see things. Goodbye, little home," she called, and the Little Red House felt just the least bit comforted to think that Emily Ann was sorry to leave him. Then she went off down the winding path with Sim, and Sim began to shout his tinker's song again. The Little Red House watched them go down the mountain. Away they went, through the gate, past the black stump, round the bracken patch and over the bridge, across the potato paddock, through the slip rails, getting smaller and smaller, past the signpost, down by the big rocks, getting smaller and smaller, under the tree ferns, out onto the stony flat, across the red road, until they were just two tiny specks away down in the valley. Then they went through a white gate, round a turn, and the high scrub hid them. Had you been able to see the Little Red House just at that moment, you would have been sure he was going to cry. He looked so miserable and so lonely. "Cheer up," said the big blue gum. But the Little Red House couldn't say a word. Presently the big blue gum groaned loudly. "Ooh, golly," groaned the blue gum in a strange voice. "I beg your pardon," said the Little Red House. "Oh, I have a nasty sharp pain in my side," said the blue gum. "I do hope and trust it isn't white ants. It would be simply horrible if it were. Fancy getting white ants at my time of life. Here I have lived on this mountain, tree and sapling, for over 100 years. And to think those nasty, white, flabby little things should get me at last is horrible, horrible." "I am sorry," said the Little Red House. "I'm afraid I've been very selfish too. I was forgetting that everyone has troubles of his own, but I hope it isn't so bad as you fear." "It is bad enough," groaned the blue gum. "Ow! There it is again. I'm afraid it is white ants. I can feel the wretched little things nipping." But the Little Red House hardly heard him. He was thinking again of his own troubles. So they stood all through that day, saying very little to each other. Rabbits came and played about the Little Red House, and lizards ran over his doorstep, and once a big wallaby went flopping right past the front gate. But the Little Red House paid no attention. He was too busy thinking of his loneliness. Birds came and perched in the branches of the big blue gum, and chattered and sang to him, trying to tell him the news of other trees on distant mountains. But the big blue gum took no notice. He was too busy thinking about white ants. So the sun sank low behind the little house, and the shadow of the tall blue gum began to creep down the mountain and get longer and longer. Just as it was growing dark, the big blue gum said suddenly, "It certainly looks more like rain than ever. The heavy clouds have been gathering all day, and we shall get it properly tonight." But the rain did not come that night, nor the next day, nor for 2 days and nights, and all this while the Little Red House and the big blue gum remained silent and miserable, one through loneliness, the other through white ants. But on the evening of the 3rd day the big blue gum said, "The rain will come tonight for certain. I know by the feel of the air." "Let it come," said the Little Red House. "I don't care. I couldn't be more miserable than I am." Just as he said that, one great raindrop fell right on the middle of his roof. Plop. "It's coming already," cried the blue gum, "and it's going to pour." Then 3 more big drops fell. Plop, plop, plop. "I have never in my life seen such big raindrops," said the blue gum. "I've lived on this mountain, tree and sapling for—" But crash came rain before he could finish, and in 2 seconds everything was sopping wet. The noise of it was deafening. "Why, it's a cloudburst!" shouted the blue gum. "Half of my leaves have been stripped off already." Then he peered through the rain and dark to see how the Little Red House was taking it. "Why, what's the matter with your face?" he cried. "You look awful." "I'm crying," sobbed the Little Red House. "That's all. Just crying. Can't you see the tears?" "Nonsense," said the blue gum. "Those are not tears, it's just the rainwater running off your windowsills."
"I tell you I'm crying,"
wailed the little red house.
"I'm crying bitterly. I should know, shouldn't I? I'm shivering and crying because I'm cold and lonely and miserable."
"Oh, very well," agreed the blue gum. "You are crying. But if this rain doesn't stop soon, you'll cry the front path away."
"It certainly is wet."
Very late that night the rain eased a little, and then stopped altogether. The tears ceased to run from the eyes of the little red house,
and they now came only in drops,
slower and slower, falling into the great pool by the front door.
"It's a hard world,"
sobbed the little red house, squeezing out another tear. "Listen!"
cried the big blue gum.
"Do you hear that?"
From far away on the distant ranges came a dull moaning sound.
As they listened, it grew louder, and right in the middle of it came another sound. Thump! "That's the wind," said the blue gum. "And a big wind, too." "Let it come," sighed the little red house. "I couldn't be more miserable than I am." As he spoke, the moaning grew louder, and there were 3 or 4 quite big thumps, one after another. "What's that thumping?" asked the little house. "Those are my poor brothers," answered the big blue gum very sadly. "Those are trees going down before the big wind. The birds were bringing me messages from those poor fellows quite lately, and now I shall never hear from them again. It's very sad." "I never thought the wind could blow down big trees," said the little house. "No tree knows when his time will come," the big blue gum answered gravely. "I've had some very narrow escapes in my time, as tree and sapling, on this mountain." The little red house was very quiet and thoughtful for a long time after that. Then he asked suddenly, "Which way do you think you would fall, if you did fall?" But the big blue gum said that he couldn't tell. It depended on the wind, and he might fall anyway. "Not on me!" cried the little house. The blue gum said that he didn't know, but he hoped not. "If you did fall on me," said the little red house, "I suppose it would hurt me." The blue gum said it certainly would, and there would be very little left but splinters and glass. "Then don't! Please don't!" yelled the little red house. But before they could say another word, the great wind struck them with a roar. It tossed the roses about, so that the eyebrows of the little house seemed to be twitching horribly, and it swayed the big blue gum this way and that, till he appeared to be fighting for his very life. It picked up the fallen leaves and twigs, and even small stones, and hurled them down the mountain in a cloud. In the midst of all the uproar, the little house heard the blue gum calling to him. "As long as I've lived upon this mountain, tree and sapling," he shouted, "I've never known such a wind. I'm not so young as I used to be, and I fear that my end has come." "Be brave, oh, be brave," implored the little red house. "Don't let him blow you down. I should be so sorry to lose you. What are you grunting for?" "I'm not grunting," answered the blue gum in a pained voice. "Those are my roots giving way, one by one."
"I can't stand much more of this."
"Look out!" The little red house looked up, and what he saw terrified him. The big blue gum, in the clutch of the wind, was bent right over him, so that the top branches seemed to be just above his roof, and the great tree appeared to be falling helplessly. "Don't fall on me!" shrieked the little red house. "Oh, don't fall on me, because if you do, you know you'll squash me. I don't want to be squashed." But the big blue gum said, "There is just one little root holding now. If that gives way, we are both done for." "Be brave, oh, be brave!" shrieked the little red house. Then, slowly, very slowly, the big blue gum began to straighten up again, away from the little red house. "I have stood upon this mountain, tree and sapling, for over 100 years, he said when he had recovered. "But if it blows like that again, it is the end of me." But it did not blow like that again. Though the wind howled and shrieked all that day, as if it was very angry and disappointed that it could not blow down the big blue gum. Then, towards evening, the wind fell. The heavy clouds went away beyond the edge of the sky, and all became very calm and peaceful. The birds came from their hiding places and sat in the branches of the blue gum, and chattered away to him until he began to feel quite cheerful once more, in spite of his trouble. And when a certain little tree creeper, a very wise bird, came and had a long, serious talk with the blue gum, he became very much interested indeed, and quite happy. But the little red house was miserable still, and the beauty of the evening didn't cheer him up one bit. "Ah, well," said the blue gum, when the darkness came to the mountain, "I'm going to have a good sleep tonight. I'm a match still for old Daddy Wind, in spite of all his noise and bluster. And there are ways of dealing with white ants too. I've lived upon this mountain, tree and sapling, for—" But as he was talking, he fell fast asleep. The little red house did not sleep. How could he, with his eyes wide open? So he just stood there all night, staring before him, lonely and wretched. And when an owl came and sat in the tree, and began to call, "Mapoke," the little red house told him rudely to stop his silly noise, and clear out. That will just show you how very miserable he was. It was quite late next morning when the blue gum awoke. He stretched his big limbs and began to wonder what he might say to comfort the little red house. But when the blue gum looked down, he saw that the little red house was smiling all over his face. "Well now," cried the big blue gum cheerfully, "that's the kind of face I like to see in the morning. So you've decided to be sensible and forget your loneliness?" But the little red house didn't say a word. He just went on smiling. Then the big blue gum began to get uneasy. "I do hope your troubles haven't turned you silly," he said. "You haven't lost your senses, have you?" "I?" cried the little red house. "Why, look down the valley! See who's coming!" Down, far down the valley, just coming through the white gate, were two figures that looked like tiny specks. And much nearer was another speck, which was certainly a little dog. "It's them! I mean, those are they!" shouted the little red house happily. "Sim and Emily Ann, and here comes our little dog." "Well, you certainly have sharp eyes," replied the blue gum. "But I suppose I'm getting old. Over 100 years, you know." The two figures were through the white gate now, and had crossed the red road out onto the stony flats, getting bigger and bigger as they came, and the smile on the little red house seemed to grow broader and broader. On they came under the tree ferns, up by the big rocks, past the signpost. And now the little red house could hear Sim singing his tinker's song. But it was not quite the same song this time. "Kettles and pans, ho, kettles and pans, where's there a home like the tinkering man's? Weary of wandering, home is the place, the little red house with a smile on his face. Weary and hungry, my Emily Ann, then put on the kettle, ho, put on the pan." "Now that is the sort of song I do like," said the little red house, as he watched them coming up the mountain. On they came, growing bigger and bigger, through the slip rails, across the potato paddock, over the bridge, round by the bracken patch, past the black stump, through the gate, and here they were right at the front door. "Oh, I am glad to be home again," cried Emily Ann. "And do look at the little house. He seems to be smiling." "Of course he is smiling," answered Sim, "but he has a very dirty face." "The storm did that," said Emily Ann. "Now hurry and get the fire alight, and I'll put the kettle on." And they went inside, laughing and singing, while the little dog flew round the house, barking for dear life, and pretending he was very busy, seeing everything was in order. "Now I suppose you're happy," said the big blue gum to the little red house. "Happy?" cried the little house. "Of course I am. Why, I'm a home again." But suddenly he remembered that his own happiness had made him forget all about his old friend's troubles, and he tried his best to look serious as he said, "But what about you? Are the white ants still troubling you?" "Ah," replied the blue gum, "don't let that worry you. Yesterday I had a talk with the doctor. Dr. Tree Creeper, you know. A very clever little bird he is, and he knows all about white ants. He examined me thoroughly all over. He says that they have hardly got under my skin yet, and he will have them all out in a couple of days. So that's all right." "Well, I am glad," shouted the Little Red House. "Now we are all happy." Then Sim got the fire started, and the smoke curled up, and the little house had his gay blue feather once again. Sim began to sing his Tinker's song louder than ever, and Emily Ann, who was getting the meal ready, joined in, and sang too. Very soon the kettle also began to sing, and when the pan heard that, he began to sing. Then Dr. Tree Creeper arrived to attend to the white ants, and as he walked round the trunk of the big blue gum, tapping it just like a doctor, he began to sing. And 2 kookaburras, who were sitting on the fence, were so tickled with it all that they laughed and laughed till they made everyone else laugh with them. "This is quite like old times," laughed the big blue gum. "Are you contented now?" "Am I contented?" cried the Little Red House. "Am I contented? Well, what would you think?" And then, well, most ordinary grown-up folk would tell you that just then Emily Ann drew down one of the front blinds. But all the big blue gum knew, and all you and I know, is that the Little Red House winked. And when I saw him last, his smile was as broad as ever, and he was still winking. End of The Little Red House by C.J. Dennis. Read by Lucy Perry, in Bath, on January 28th, 2012.
Rumpelstiltskin by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Rumpelstiltskin. There was once a poor miller who had a beautiful daughter, and one day, having to go speak with the king, he said, in order to make himself appear of consequence, that he had a daughter who could spin straw into gold. The king was very fond of gold, and thought to himself, "That is an art which would please me very well," and so he said to the miller, "If your daughter is so very clever, bring her to the castle in the morning, and I will put her to the proof." As soon as she arrived, the king led her into a chamber which was full of straw, and giving her a wheel and a reel, he said, "Now set yourself to work, and if you have not spun this straw into gold by an early hour tomorrow, you must die." With these words he shut the room door and left the maiden alone. There she sat for a long time, thinking how to save her life, for she understood nothing of the art whereby straw might be spun into gold, and her perplexity increased more and more, till at last she began to weep. All at once the door opened, and in stepped a little man, who said, "Good evening, fair maiden. Why do you weep so sore?" "Ah," she replied, "I must spin this straw into gold, and I am sure I do not know how." The little man asked, "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" "My necklace," said the maiden. The dwarf took it, placed himself in front of the wheel, and whir, 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 3 times round, and the bobbin was full. Then he set up another, and whir, 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 thrice round again, and a second bobbin was full. And so he went all night long, until all the straw was spun, and the bobbins were full of gold. At sunrise the king came, very much astonished to see the gold, the sight of which gladdened him, but did not make his heart less covetous. He caused the maiden to be led into another room, still larger, full of straw, and then he bade her spin it into gold during the night, if she valued her life. The maiden was again quite at a loss what to do, but while she cried, the door opened suddenly, as before, and the dwarf appeared, and asked her what she would give him in return for his assistance. "The ring off my finger," she replied. The little man took the ring and began to spin at once, and by morning all the straw was changed to glistening gold. The king was rejoiced above measure at the sight of this, but still he was not satisfied, but leading the maiden into another still larger room, full of straw as the others, he said, "This you must spin during the night, but if you accomplish it, you shall be my bride." For, he thought to himself, "A richer wife thou canst not have in all the world." When the maiden was left alone, the dwarf appeared again and asked, for the 3rd time, "What will you give me to do this for you?" "I have nothing left that I can give you," replied the maiden. "Then promise me your first-born child if you become queen," said he. The miller's daughter thought, "Who can tell if that will ever happen?" and, ignorant how else to help herself out of her trouble, she promised the dwarf what he desired, and he immediately set about and finished the spinning. When morning came, and the king found all he had wished for done, he celebrated his wedding, and the miller's fair daughter became queen. The gay time she had at the king's court caused her to forget that she had made a very foolish promise. About a year after the marriage, when she had ceased to think about the little dwarf, she brought a fine child into the world, and, suddenly, soon after its birth, the very man appeared and demanded what she had promised. The frightened queen offered him all the riches of the kingdom if he would leave her her child, but the dwarf answered, "No, something human is dearer to me than all the wealth of the world." The queen began to weep and groan so much that the dwarf pitied her, and said, "I will leave you 3 days to consider. If you in that time discover my name, you shall keep your child." All night long the queen racked her brains for all the names she could think of, and sent a messenger through the country to collect far and wide any new names. The following morning came the dwarf, and she began with Caspar, Melchior, Balthazar, and all the odd names she knew, but at each the little man exclaimed, "That is not my name." The second day the queen inquired of all her people for uncommon and curious names, and called the dwarf Ribs-a-beef, Sheepshank, Whalebone, but at each he said, "This is not my name." The third day the messenger came back and said, "I have not found a single name, but as I came to a high mountain near the edge of a forest, where foxes and hares say good night to each other, I saw there a little house, and before the door a fire was burning, and round this fire a very curious little man was dancing on one leg and shouting, 'Today I stew, and then I'll bake, tomorrow I shall the queen's child take. Ah, how famous it is that nobody knows that my name is Rumpelstiltskin.'" When the queen heard this, she was very glad, for now she knew the name, and soon after came the dwarf and asked, "Now, my lady queen, what is my name?" First she said, "Are you called Conrad?" "No." "Are you called Hal?" "No." "Are you called Rumpelstiltskin?" "A witch has told you! A witch has told you!" shrieked the little man, and stamped his right foot so hard in the ground with rage that he could not draw it out again. Then he took hold of his left leg with both his hands, and pulled away so hard that his right came off in the struggle, and he hopped away, howling terribly. And from that day to this, the queen has heard no more of her troublesome visitor. End of Rumpelstiltskin by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. Read by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org, on Tuesday, January 14th, 2014, in San Diego, California.
The King of the Polar Bears by L. Frank Baum. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The King of the Polar Bears lived among the icebergs in the far north country. He was old and monstrous big. He was wise and friendly to all who knew him. His body was thickly covered with long white hair that glistened like silver under the rays of the midnight sun. His claws were strong and sharp, that he might walk safely over the smooth ice, or grasp and tear the fishes and seals upon which he fed. The seals were afraid when he drew near, and tried to avoid him. But the gulls, both white and gray, loved him, because he left the remnants of his feast for them to devour. Often his subjects, the polar bears, came to him for advice when ill or in trouble, but they wisely kept away from his hunting grounds, lest they might interfere with his sport and arouse his anger. The wolves, who sometimes came as far north as the icebergs, whispered among themselves that the king of the polar bears was either a magician or under the protection of a powerful fairy, for no earthly thing seemed able to harm him. He never failed to secure plenty of food, and he grew bigger and stronger day by day and year by year. Yet the time came when this monarch of the north met man, and his wisdom failed him. He came out of his cave among the icebergs one day and saw a boat moving through the strip of water which had been uncovered by the shifting of the summer ice. In the boat were men. The great bear had never seen such creatures before, and therefore advanced toward the boat, sniffing the strange scent with aroused curiosity, and wondering whether he might take them for friends or foes, food or carrion. When the king came near the water's edge, a man stood up in the boat and with a queer instrument made a loud bang. The polar bear felt a shock. His brain became numb. His thoughts deserted him. His great limbs shook and gave way beneath him, and his body fell heavily upon the hard ice. That was all he remembered for a time. When he awoke, he was smarting with pain on every inch of his huge bulk, for the men had cut away his hide with its glorious white hair and carried it with them to a distant ship. Above him circled thousands of his friends, the gulls, wondering if their benefactor were really dead and it was proper to eat him. But when they saw him raise his head and groan and tremble, they knew he still lived. And one of them said to his comrades, "The wolves were right. The king is a great magician, for even men cannot kill him. But he suffers for lack of covering. Let us repay his kindness to us by each giving him as many feathers as we can spare." This idea pleased the gulls. One after another, they plucked with their beaks the softest feathers from under their wings, and flying down, dropped them gently upon the body of the king of the polar bears. Then they called to him in a chorus, "Courage, friend! Our feathers are as soft and beautiful as your own shaggy hair. They will guard you from the cold winds and warm you while you sleep. Have courage, then, and live." And the king of the polar bears had courage to bear his pain and lived, and was strong again. The feathers grew as they had grown upon the bodies of the birds, and covered him as his own hair had done. Mostly they were pure white in color, but some from the gray gulls gave his majesty a slight mottled appearance. The rest of that summer, and all through the 6 months of night, the king left his icy cavern only to fish or catch seals for food. He felt no shame at his feathery covering, but it was still strange to him, and he avoided meeting any of his brother bears. During this period of retirement, he thought much of the men who had harmed him, and remembered the way they had made the great bang, and he decided it was best to keep away from such fierce creatures. Thus he added to his store of wisdom. When the moon fell away from the sky and the sun came to make the icebergs glitter with the gorgeous tintings of the rainbow, 2 of the polar bears arrived at the king's cavern to ask his advice about the hunting season. But when they saw his great body covered with feathers instead of hair, they began to laugh, and one said, "Our mighty king has become a bird. Who ever heard of a feathered polar bear?" Then the king gave way to wrath. He advanced upon them with deep growls and stately tread, and with one blow of his monstrous paw stretched the mocker lifeless at his feet. The other ran away to his fellows and carried the news of the king's strange appearance. The result was a meeting of all the polar bears upon a broad field of ice, where they talked gravely of the remarkable change that had come upon their monarch. "He is, in reality, no longer a bear," said one, "nor can he justly be called a bird. But he is half bird and half bear, and so unfitted to remain our king." "Then who shall take his place?" asked another. "He who can fight the bird-bear and overcome him," answered an aged member of the group. "Only the strongest is fit to rule our race." There was silence for a time, but at length a great bear moved to the front and said, "I will fight him. I, Wolf, the strongest of our race, and I will be king of the polar bears." The others nodded assent, and dispatched a messenger to the king to say he must fight the great wolf and master him, or resign his sovereignty. "For a bear with feathers," added the messenger, "is no bear at all, and the king we obey must resemble the rest of us." "I wear feathers because it pleases me," growled the king. "Am I not a great magician? But I will fight nevertheless, and if Wolf masters me, he shall be king in my stead." Then he visited his friends the gulls, who were even then feasting upon the dead bear, and told them of the coming battle. "I shall conquer," he said proudly. "Yet my people are in the right, for only a hairy one like themselves can hope to command their obedience." The queen gull said, "I met an eagle yesterday, which had made its escape from a big city of men. And the eagle told me he had seen a monstrous polar bear skin thrown over the back of a carriage that rolled along the street. That skin must have been yours, O king, and if you wish, I will send 100 of my gulls to the city to bring it back to you." "Let them go," said the king gruffly, and the 100 gulls were soon flying rapidly southward. For 3 days they flew straight as an arrow, until they came to scattered houses, to villages, and to cities. Then their search began. The gulls were brave and cunning and wise. Upon the 4th day they reached the great metropolis and hovered over the streets until a carriage rolled along with a great white bear robe thrown over the back seat. Then the birds swooped down, the whole 100 of them, and seizing the skin in their beaks, flew quickly away. They were late. The king's great battle was upon the 7th day. They must fly swiftly to reach the polar regions by that time. Meanwhile, the bird bear was preparing for his fight. He sharpened his claws in the small crevices of the ice. He caught a seal and tested his big yellow teeth by crunching its bones between them. And the queen gull set her band to pluming the king bear's feathers until they lay smoothly upon his body. But every day they cast anxious glances into the southern sky, watching for the 100 gulls to bring back the king's own skin. The 7th day came, and all the polar bears in that region gathered around the king's cavern. Among them was Wolf, strong and confident of his success. "The bird bear's feathers will fly fast enough when I get my claws upon him," he boasted. And the others laughed and encouraged him. The king was disappointed at not having recovered his skin, but he resolved to fight bravely without it. He advanced from the opening of his cavern with a proud and kingly bearing, and when he faced his enemy, he gave so terrible a growl that Wolf's heart stopped beating for a moment, and he began to realize that a fight with the wise and mighty king of his race was no laughing matter. After exchanging 1 or 2 heavy blows with his foe, Wolf's courage returned, and he determined to dishearten his adversary by bluster. "Come nearer, bird bear," he cried. "Come nearer, that I may pluck your plumage." The defiance filled the king with rage. He ruffled his feathers as a bird does, till he appeared to be twice his actual size. And then he strode forward and struck Wolf so powerful a blow that his skull cracked like an eggshell, and he fell prone upon the ground. While the assembled bears stood looking with fear and wonder at their fallen champion, the sky became darkened. 100 gulls flew down from above and dripped upon the king's body a skin covered with pure white hair that glittered in the sun like silver. And behold, the bears saw before them the well-known form of their wise and respected master, and with one accord they bowed their shaggy heads in homage to the mighty king of the polar bears. This story teaches us that true dignity and courage depend not upon outward appearance, but come rather from within. Also that brag and bluster are poor weapons to carry into battle. End of The King of the Polar Bears by L. Frank Baum. Recorded by Laura Armentrout.
A Daydream by Carolyn Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Polly's patchwork, oh dear me, truly is a sight to see. Rumpled, crumpled, soiled and frayed, will the quilt ever be made? See the stitches yawning wide. Can it be that Polly tried? Some are right and some are wrong. Some too short and some too long. Some too loose and some too tight. Grimy smudges on the white. And a tiny spot of red where poor Polly's finger bled. Strange, such pretty dainty blocks, bits of Polly's summer frocks. Should have proved so hard to sew, and the cause of so much woe. One day it was very hot, and the thread got in a knot. Drew the seam up in a heap. Polly calmly fell asleep. Then she had a lovely dream. Straight and even was the seam. Pure and spotless was the white, and the blocks were finished quite. Each joined to another one. Lo, behold, the quilt was done. Lined and quilted, and it seemed to cover Polly as she dreamed. End of A Daydream by Carolyn Wells. Read by Eve McCool.
Little Biddy's Birthday by Shara B. Conant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claudia Salto. Mother, can I have a birthday? A birthday? Asked Mrs. Keeney, pausing in the midst of her washing and looking down, half bewildered, half amused, at her little daughter. Yes, Mother, I have birthdays, don't I? Just the same as Mabel Ray? Sure, there's no mistake about that, darling, laughed her mother, resuming her work. 8 years ago next week you came into this troublesome world. That's 2 things we have in common with the rich anyhow, the day of our birth and the day of our death. But, Mother, persisted Biddy, her big blue eyes rounder still with eagerness, can't I have a party on my birthday? Mabel Ray had one last week. Eliza told me so. And she had ice cream and cake with raisins in it, and a wax door what opens its eyes, and lots of children come to play with her. And, oh, Mother, sakes alive, Biddy, what's got into you? Said her mother, gazing down at her with a mingling of pride, amusement, and regret. No bonnier child than Biddy could you find anywhere. Her complexion was a pure red and white, her hair chestnut falling in natural curls over her shoulders, her mouth as sweet a rosebud as Mabel Ray's. She's as pretty as any lady's child of them all, thought her mother, and as gentle and good. But aloud she said decidedly, Honey, you're talking nonsense. I've hard work enough to keep us both in bread and mate, let alone clothes, without giving parties for you. Ice cream and cake indeed. It's a nigger waiter you'll be wanting next, to be opening the door for your stylish friends, she went on, chuckling as she wrung out one of Mrs. Ray's embroidered white skirts. Oh, Mother, I know you couldn't give me such a party, but I thought I might have just a few little friends in to play with me, and we'd have some crackers and some ginger cookies maybe, and them 2 pennies you gave me would buy candy and nuts, and And who do you want to invite, may I ask? Said the mother, trying not to laugh. Oh, Mother, if I could ask poor little Jim Swaney, the boy what lives across the way. He's lame, you know, and little Annie, his sister. They're so poor, and the father gets drunk and baits them awful. I'd like them to have a good time for once. Bless your little heart, said the mother. You shall have them in and welcome, and I'll buy some cookies to trade them with, and maybe something besides. But don't you ask another child in this neighborhood. They're a bold, bad set, as you know, and it's sorry I am we have to live in the midst of them. No, mother, I won't, but I do wish I could ask some of the girls I go to school with. There's Sally Flynn and Jenny Dean and Mary Connor and Anne Gormley and Kitty Fay and— Saints preserve us, cried Mrs. Keeney. Do you want to bring all New York in on me? No, no, honey, I can't afford such a party as that. Be off to school now like a good child, and don't bother me no more. But the pleading face of her little girl, the only child she had, haunted Mary Keeney, and when, later in the day, some unexpected work arrived from a lady to whom Mrs. Ray had recommended her, she resolved at once to gratify her darling. It comes only once a year, she said, and she's the only child I've got. I'll buy 'em some cookies and gingerbread and a half-dozen lemons to make some lemonade with, and I hope they'll be satisfied, for I can't do no more. So Biddy, to her great joy, was allowed to invite half a dozen little girls, her most intimate friends, to her party, which would take place Thursday afternoon of the following week. When Mrs. Keeney took Mrs. Ray's clothes home Thursday afternoon, she told Eliza, the chambermaid, as a good joke about her little girl's party and the expected guests. Thursday afternoon came, and about 4 o'clock lame Jim and his sister arrived, and were received by Biddy, fresh and sweet as a pink, in her clean cambric frock, with a rose-coloured ribbon tied above her shining hair. Mrs. Keeney had but 2 little rooms in the 3rd story of a tenement house, but though poor and scantily furnished, they were kept as clean and sweet as broom and scrubbing-brush could make them. How happy little Jim was! How his sweet, wan face brightened like a pale flower brought into the sunshine! Mrs. Keeney placed him in her one rocking-chair, and gave him and little Annie a drink of milk and a goodly slice of bread and butter straight away, for she knew how little they had to eat at home. And soon arrived the 6 girls all together, and what a merry clatter of tongues there was in that little kitchen. They were just as happy as if they had worn silk dresses and kid slippers, happier perhaps. Soon all were engaged in a merry game of hide the thimble, Jim as active as anyone, hopping nimbly about on his crutches. At last they found the thimble snugly hid in his pocket, where Kitty Fay had cunningly slipped it, unknown even to the boy himself. Game followed game in quick succession, until Mrs. Keeney, who had been looking on smiling, ordered them into the bedroom. "Guess she's setting the table," said Mary Connor. "I hear the dishes rattling," and hereupon they all fell a-chuckling. A few moments after they were called into the next room. "Ain't it just elegant?" whispered Anne Gormley to Sally Flynn. "Look at those sugar cookies, and oh my, there's lemonade, I smell it." "Can't you behave?" said Sally reprovingly. "One would think you'd never been to a party before." "No more I haven't," said Anne, quite above concealment. "Oh, goody Sally, there's slices of meat between the bread and butter." "Ain't she a greedy?" whispered Sally to Jenny. "Poor thing, they say she's most starved at home," said kindly little Jenny. "Her father's been out of work these 3 months." Mary Keeney, hospitable-hearted soul, had not been able to content herself with the bill of fare she at first meditated. The table was bountifully spread with sandwiches, cookies, molasses cake, rosy-cheeked apples, and a plate of gay-colored candy in the center. Biddy's cheeks were like roses and her eyes like stars. Was there ever such a mother and such a party? The good cheer soon set all the little tongues going, while Mrs. Keeney watched the fun, well pleased, and kept the plates and glasses filled. In the midst of their festivity, Mrs. Keeney was called downstairs. She came up in a few moments with something wrapped up in her apron. The children were too absorbed to notice her, but when in a few moments she appeared bearing a big earthen platter exultingly aloft, what a shout went up from all the little throats. "Ice cream! Ice cream!" Even demure Sally joined in the cry, and Anne Gormley nearly fell out of her chair in her joyful excitement. "Oh, mother, mother, have you given all your money for my party?" cried Biddy, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, and feeling a pang of self-reproach amid her transports. "My lamb, who sent it I don't know, but I mistrust Mrs. Ray. And look at the elegant cake with the deep white frosting, and the Charlotte Russies too," she added, setting 2 other dishes on the table. The children sat a moment, dumb with admiration, then set up another shout. "The man said he'd a horrible job to find the place, and I reckon it's the first ice cream and Charlotte Russies found their way to Reed Lane," said Mrs. Keeney, who scarcely knew whether to laugh or cry herself. "Oh, mother, wasn't it lovely in Mrs. Ray?" "Troth it was, darling. It must be Eliza told her, and—" Scarcely were the words out of her mouth when a loud rap at the door made her start. "Sakes alive, I hope nobody's come to say the ice cream went to the wrong place." She opened the door. There stood John, Mrs. Ray's colored man. "Good evening, Mrs. Keeney," surveying her with a condescending smile. "Here's a package for Biddy, with Miss Mabel's love. Sorry to be so late, but I had a number of other errands, and it was hard to find the place. Good evening." And before Mrs. Keeney could speak, he was gone, anxious to escape a reproof from his mistress for his delay. With trembling fingers, Mrs. Keeney undid the strings, while the little group looked breathlessly on. But when at last she brought out a doll, a lovely wax doll with golden hair and large brown eyes, a cry of admiration broke from all but Biddy. She stood speechless, with flushed cheeks and dilated eyes, gazing up at the doll. "Ugh, darling, where's your tongue?" cried Mrs. Keeney. "Such a sweet doll, dressed up so elegant, and she can open and shut her eyes. Look, honey, look. Why, what are you crying for?" "It's too beautiful," sobbed little Biddy. "Everything's so beautiful, I don't know what to do." That night, as Biddy lay in her bed while her mother was tucking her in, she said with a long sigh, "Oh, mother, mother, I'm so glad I've had a birthday. I'll never forget it as long as I live. Oh, mother, wasn't it just beautiful?" "Yes, dear," said Mrs. Keeney, but a little jealous pang gnawing at her heart made her add, "I couldn't give you ice cream, darling, nor wax dolls, but—" Biddy threw both her arms round her mother's neck. "Oh, mother, dear darling mother, what you did was most of all. Oh, there never was a mother like mine." A tear rolled down the mother's cheek. What reward could be sweeter than those loving words, the clasp of those little arms about her neck? And so ended Biddy's happy birthday. End of Little Biddy's Birthday by Chara B. Conant. The Newsboys Home and How It Helped Joe by F. E. Fryett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claudia Salto.
Here's your 5 o'clock edition, Post, Express and Commercial. Full account of General Garfield on the towpath, shouted 3 urchins, planting themselves directly before a portly old gentleman who was slowly puffing upstairs to the elevated railway.
"Clear out, you little scamps," grumbled the besieged, adding more amiably as he caught sight of the youngest of the 3, "Give me a post, sonny, and change this quarter."
"Thank'ee, sir,"
said Joe Brown, the lucky competitor, diving into the deepest of pockets for the needful coppers, then dashing pell-mell after his comrades in pursuit of a probable customer.
"Post, Express and Commercial, full account of General Garfield,"
still rang the cry an hour later, while in and out, up and down, and across the streets darted the lithe, eager little fellows, until the crowd began to thin out, the papers were nearly all sold, and a distant bell reminded them that if they wanted their 6-cent supper, it was high time to be off for the lodging-house. Let us follow them as they hasten to the lofty brick building which stands on the triangle formed by the meeting of New Chambers, Duane, and North William streets. The great doors are wide open. We pass in with Joe, his 2 comrades, and half a score of bustling, laughing lads, mount 2 long flights of stone steps, and enter the large lecture or schoolroom on the 2nd story, with its rows of desks and benches and the convenient lockers or closets against the walls. One by one, in orderly fashion, the boys step within the iron railing, state their names, ages, and parentage to the clerk, receive numbered keys to their lockers, and pass on. Here a lad locks up his bundle of unsold papers until after supper, another his blacking box and brushes, a third his hat and jacket, then away for the lavatory, with its long ranges of foot and plunge baths, and its shining basins under the bright copper faucets. Business must be unusually brisk, or the demands of the inner man unusually lively, if one may judge by the celerity with which the boys appear, brushed and combed and ruddy-faced, for supper.
"Hurry up, Bill, and get your ticket,"
cried Joe, passing up to the desk and depositing 12 cents for bed and supper, then taking his place at the end of the line that was already on the move. 60, 61, 2, 3, 4, called the superintendent as the boys filed past, and the tramp of descending feet comes to us through the open doorway. By the time we reach the dining-room, with its expanse of polished floors and high column-supported ceiling, 70 or 80 boys are seated at long tables, which present an inviting appearance with their white enamelled cloths, platters piled high with bread, and rows of capacious bowls steaming with fragrant tea. What a busy scene it is for the time. The bread mountains diminish like snow before the sun, the tea fountains vanish like rain on thirsty soil, and the young women attendants, in their neat dresses and aprons, pass to and fro continually with their renewing bread trays and flagons of tea and syrup. The majority of the boys laugh and chatter like magpies, but here and there sits a silent little news merchant, whose mind, absorbed with visions of extras, hurries him on to the wished-for future. See, there they go, half a dozen of them, with quick steps and anxious faces. They will notify the watchmen that they must keep late hours and pay the required trifle for retaining their locker keys beyond time. Up to midnight their shrill cries will ring through the gas-lighted thoroughfares of the great city, while many,
or indeed most, of the young readers of this paper are dreaming happy dreams in bed. It is now nearly 8 o'clock. Supper is over, and the boys disperse for the short evening left them before bedtime, for all must be within doors at 9:30, or pay a fine. Some of the boys go out for a walk. Others, I am sorry to say, to spend their earnings at the cheap theatres and shows of the city, but the sensible ones drop their spare pennies or silver coins into the odd-looking savings bank near the door, and hasten upstairs to the reading room or the gymnasium. Let us follow some of them to the latter. What a jolly place it is! One could have no end of fun with its horizontal and parallel bars, its rings, ladders, and flying trapeze. It is better than a circus. There's a race for you already on that long ladder rising from one side of the room, crossing over, and coming down on the other slantwise. Johnny Wilson has started at the north end, Billy Jones at the south end. There they go, hand over hand. Now they meet overhead in the middle. I declare, Billy's feet touch the floor first. He has beaten by 3 rounds. "Hurrah for Billy! 3 cheers for Billy Jones!" shout the boys who are watching them. Yonder 3 lads are trying their strength, lifting iron weights in the corner. Tough work they find it, and soon leave to take a look at a comrade who hangs by his feet from a horizontal bar. Now he swings back and forth before the little group, who are eager to risk their necks in the wonderful experiment. See! He lets go, and with a dexterous swing catches by his hands, and drops safe and sound before his admirers. This is nothing to what is going on yonder, where 2 boys are performing prodigious feats on the flying trapeze, squirming and twisting and turning somersaults, hanging by their chins, then by their toes, and then by each other, until the looker-on trembles and grows dizzy. Let us look for wee John Brown. He is not here. Neither is he in the reading room below stairs, where a dozen or more youngsters are amusing themselves quietly, some reading storybooks and illustrated papers, others playing checkers or dominoes. I'll tell you where Joe is. He is one of the early birds. Since 4 o'clock in the morning, when he went out for his daily papers, only when he ate his simple meals, his busy little feet have paddled about the great city, his childish voice has shrilled forth the familiar cry, "Sun, Herald, and Tribune, Post, Express, and Commercial," until, too sleepy to read, too weary for even the fascination of watching the flying trapezists, he sought the solid comfort of the dormitory. Look in at the long tiers of beds, one above another, like berths in a steamboat. In number 69 you will find Joe sleeping the sleep of the innocent and weary. Would not the young people like to hear how Joe happens to be in the Newsboys Home? I'll tell you. It all came about through Lenny Williams, who is a call boy at one of the small theatres uptown, and lives at the Duane Street lodging house. Very late one stormy night in the midwinter, as he was coming home from his work, he fancied he heard a child sobbing, and stopping, he discovered by the feeble flickering light of a gas lamp a small figure crouching in the low doorway of one of the old-fashioned shops of that quarter. His heart gave a great bound of pity and sympathy for the poor homeless little creature so tattered and forlorn. His own jacket was wet without, but within it was dry and warm. To pull it off and place it around the shoulders of the shivering child was but the work of an instant.
"Get up on your pins, little one, and come along with me," said Lenny, assisting him and buttoning the jacket close under his throat. With difficulty the poor child, whom you must have guessed before this was Joe Brown, rose and limped along, for he was stiff with cold and weak with hunger. Before they reached the lodging-house, Lenny won from him his pitiful story, how, driven from home by the cruelty of his drunken father and stepmother, he had wandered the streets from day to day, managing by dint of begging and running errands and sleeping in dark corners known only to the wretched and homeless, to keep soul and body together while the fine weather lasted. A kind old apple-woman only yesterday had given him a basket and some matches to sell, but then came the cold, pitiless rain, and nobody wanted to buy anything, so he had strayed from street to street until he had lost his way in the dark, and sat down, utterly worn out and famished, where Lenny found him. "Yes, chicken," said Lenny, as he finished his sad story, "you'd have froze to death as sure as a gun. But cheer up, here we're home at last." Never will Joe forget the glow and warmth of the drying-room into which he was led. There were 3 other boys there hanging up their wet clothes to dry, and wasn't the bath warm and delightful into which they plunged him? For a long time Joe could not understand why there should be a clean whole shirt, a jacket and trousers, socks and shoes, all ready for such a poor, miserable little stranger. And the bowl of hot bread and milk, what a luxury it was! Surely he must be in heaven, the place where all good, unhappy boys go when they die. Perhaps he had really died out in that pitiless storm, and was there? He rubbed his eyes and expected to see wings, and was disappointed at not finding them. The books of the institution tell how the 7-year-old child, deserted by his inhuman parents, was taken within the sheltering doors of the lodging-house, but in another book the recording angel has written how a simple call-boy on that dark night did the will of his heavenly master. That night Joe had a blessed sleep in his little bed with its nice sheets and downy comfortables, so that when he woke the next morning he was a new little man. But after breakfast he was happier than a king, for the superintendent loaned him a small sum of money to buy some newspapers. 2 or 3 of the boys volunteered to teach him lots about selling them, and they did, for before night he had sold 2 sets of morning and evening papers. A prouder, more independent little fellow than Joe cannot be found anywhere, because he not only earns his meals and lodging, and helps a comrade occasionally, but every night drops pennies or nickels into savings box number 90. This he has been doing for some months. At the end of each he receives 10% interest. Joe, being studious and ambitious, faithfully attends the evening schools. He does not mean to grow up to be an ignorant, useless man. Besides, he must make the most of his time, for he indulges in the dream of a happy home in the country, and though he hasn't told me, I am sure he is saving up that money to buy a good stock of books to take with him. End of The Newsboys Home and How It Helped Joe by F. E. Fryatt.
The Three Bears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Karina Pereira. The Three Bears by Ferbush, Hale, and Mabie. Little Goldilocks was a pretty girl who lived once upon a time in a far-off country. One day, she was sitting on the hearthrug playing with her two kittens, and you would have thought she was as happy as a queen, and quite contented to stay where she was, instead of wanting to run about the world, meddling with other people's property. But it happened that she was rather a mischievous little maid, and could not resist teasing her pets, so one of them scratched her, and then she would play with them no longer. She got up and trotted away into the wood behind her mother's house, and it was such a warm, pleasant day that she wandered on and on until she came into a part of the wood where she had never been before. Now, in this wood there lived a family of 3 bears. The first was a great big bear, the second was a middling-sized bear, and the third was a little teeny tiny bear, and they all lived together in a funny little house, and very happy they were. Goldilocks stopped when she came to the bear's house, and began to wonder who lived there. "I'll just look in and see," she said, and so she did. But there was no one there, for the bears had all gone out for a morning walk, whilst the soup they were going to have for dinner cooled upon the table. Goldilocks was rather hungry after her walk, and the soup smelled so good that she began to wish the people of the house would come home and invite her to have some. But although she looked everywhere, under the table and into the cupboards, she could find no one, and at last she could resist no longer, but made up her mind to take just a little sip to see how the soup tastes. The soup had been put in 3 bowls. A great big bowl for the great big bear, a middling-sized bowl for the middling-sized bear, and a teeny tiny bowl for the teeny tiny bear. Beside each bowl lay a spoon, and Goldilocks took one and helped herself to a spoonful of soup from the great big bowl. Ugh! How it burned her mouth! It was so hot with pepper that she did not like it at all. Still, she was very hungry, so she thought she would try again. This time, she took a sip of the middling-sized bear's soup, but she liked that no better, for it was too salt. But when she tasted the teeny tiny bear's soup, it was just as she liked it, so she ate it up every drop, without thinking twice about it. When she had finished her dinner, she noticed 3 chairs standing by the wall. One was a great big chair, and she climbed upon that and sat down. Oh dear, how hard it was! She was sure she could not sit there for long, so she climbed up on the next, which was only a middling-sized chair, but that was too soft for her taste, so she went on to the last, which was a teeny tiny chair, and suited her exactly. It was so comfortable that she sat on and on until, if you'll believe it, she actually sat the bottom out. Then, of course, she was comfortable no longer, so she got up and began to wonder what she should do next. There was a staircase in the bear's house, and Goldilocks thought she would go up it and see where it led to. So up she went, and when she reached the top, she laughed outright, for the bear's bedroom was the funniest she had ever seen. In the middle of the room stood a great big bed. On one side of it there was a middling-sized bed, and on the other side there was a teeny tiny bed. Goldilocks was sleepy, so she thought she would lie down and have a little nap. First, she got upon the great big bed, but it was just as hard as the great big chair had been. So she jumped off and tried the middling-sized bed, but it was so soft that she sank right down into the feather cushions and was nearly smothered. "I will try the teeny tiny bed," she said, and so she did, and it was so comfortable that she soon fell fast asleep. Whilst she lay there, dreaming of all sorts of pleasant things, the 3 bears came home from their walk, very hungry and quite ready for their dinners. But oh, dear me, how cross the great big bear looked when he saw his spoon had been used and thrown under the table. "Who has been tasting my soup?" he cried in a great big voice. "And who has been tasting mine?" cried the middling-sized bear in a middling-sized voice. "But who has been tasting mine and tasted it all up?" cried the poor little teeny tiny bear in a teeny tiny voice, with the tears running down his teeny tiny face. When the great big bear went to sit down in his great big chair, he cried out in his great big voice, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" And the middling-sized bear cried in a middling-sized voice, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" But the teeny tiny bear cried out in a teeny tiny voice of anger, "Who has been sitting on my chair and sat the bottom out?" By this time, the bears were sure that someone had been in their house quite lately, so they looked about to see if someone were not there still. There was certainly no one downstairs, so they went up the staircase to their bathroom. As soon as the great big bear looked at his bed, he cried out in his great big voice, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the middling-sized bear, seeing that the coverlet was all rumpled, cried out in a middling-sized voice, "Who has been lying on my bed?" But the teeny tiny bear cried out in a teeny tiny voice of astonishment, "Who has been lying on my bed and lies there still?" Now, when the great big bear began to speak, Goldilocks dreamt that there was a bee buzzing in the room. And when the middling-sized bear began to speak, she dreamt that it was flying out of the window. But when the teeny tiny bear began to speak, she dreamt that the bee had come back and stung her on the ear, and up she jumped. Oh, how frightened she was when she saw the 3 bears standing beside her. She hopped out of bed, and in a second was out through the open window. Never stopping to wonder if the fall had hurt her, she got up and ran and ran and ran until she could go no farther, always thinking that the bears were close behind her. And when at length she fell down in a heap on the ground, because she was too tired to run any more, it was her own mother who picked her up, because in her fright she had run straight home without knowing it. End of The 3 Bears, recorded by Karina Pereira, 26th February 2014.
Joe Lambert's Ferry by George Carey Eggleston. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It was a thoroughly disagreeable March morning. The wind blew in sharp gusts from every quarter of the compass by turns. It seemed to take a special delight in rushing suddenly around corners and taking away the breath of anybody it could catch there coming from the opposite direction. The dust, too, filled people's eyes and noses and mouths, while the damp March air easily found its way through the best clothing and turned boys' skins into plumply goose flesh. It was about as disagreeable a morning for going out as can be imagined, and yet everybody in the little western river town who could get out went out and stayed out. Men and women, boys and girls, and even little children ran to the river bank, and once there they stayed with no thought, it seemed, of going back to their homes or their work. The people of the town were wild with excitement, and everybody told everybody else what had happened, although everybody knew all about it already. Everybody, and I mean, except Joe Lambert. And he had been so busy ever since daylight, sawing wood in Squire Crozard's woodshed, that he had neither seen nor heard anything at all. Joe was the poorest person in the town. He was the only boy there who really had no home and nobody to care for him. 3 or 4 years before this March morning, Joe had been left an orphan, and being utterly destitute, he should have been sent to the poorhouse, or bound out to some person as a sort of servant. But Joe Lambert had refused to go to the poorhouse, or to become a bound boy. He had declared his ability to take care of himself, and by working hard at odd jobs, sawing wood, rolling barrels on the wharf, picking apples, or weeding onions as opportunity offered, he had managed to support himself after a manner, as the village people said. That is to say, he generally got enough to eat, and some clothes to wear. He slept in a warehouse shed, the owner having given him leave to do so on condition that he would act as a sort of watchman on the premises. Joe Lambert alone of all the villagers knew nothing of what had happened, and of course Joe Lambert did not count for anything in the estimation of people who had houses to live in. The only reason I have gone out of the way to make an exception of so unimportant a person is that I think Joe did count for something on that particular March day at least. When he finished the pile of wood that he had to saw and went to the house to get his money, he found nobody there. Going down the street, he found the town empty, and looking down across the street, he saw the clouds that had gathered on the river bank, thus learning at last that something unusual had occurred. Of course, he ran to the river to learn what it was. When he got there, he learned that Noah Martin, the fisherman, who was also the ferryman between the village and its neighbor on the other side of the river, had been drowned during the early morning in a foolish attempt to row his ferry skiff across the stream. The ice which had blocked the river for 2 months had begun to move on the day before, and Martin, with his wife and baby, a child about a year old, were on the other side of the river at the time. Early on that morning there had been a temporary gorging of the ice about a mile above the town, and taking advantage of the comparatively free channel, Martin had tried to cross with his wife and child in his boat. The gorge had broken up almost immediately, as the river was rising rapidly, and Martin's boat had been caught and crushed in the ice. Martin had been drowned, but his wife, with her child in her arms, had clung to the wreck of the skiff, and had been carried by the current to a little low-lying island just in front of the town. What had happened was of less importance, however, and what people saw must happen. The poor woman and baby out there on the island, drenched as they had been in the icy water, must soon die with cold, and moreover, the island was now nearly under water. While the great stream was rising rapidly, it was evident that within an hour or two the water would sweep over the whole surface of the island, and the great fields of ice would of course carry the woman and child to a terrible death. Many wild suggestions were made for their rescue, but none that gave the least hope of success. It was simply impossible to launch a boat. The vast fields of ice, 2 or 3 feet in thickness, and from 20 feet to 100 yards in breadth, were crushing and grinding down the river at the rate of 4 or 5 miles an hour, turning and twisting about, sometimes jamming their edges together with so great a force that one would lap over another, and sometimes drifting apart, and leaving wide open spaces between for a moment or two. One might as well go upon such a river in an egg-shell as in the stoutest rowboat ever built. The poor woman with her baby could be seen from the shore, standing there alone on the rapidly narrowing strip of island. Her voice could not reach the people on the bank, but when she held her poor little baby toward them in mute appeal for help, the mothers there understood her agony. There was nothing to be done, however. Human sympathy was given freely, but human help was out of the question. Everybody on the river shore was agreed in that opinion. Everybody, that is to say, except Joe Lambert. He had been so long in the habit of finding ways to help himself under difficulties that he did not easily make up his mind to think any case hopeless. No sooner did Joe clearly understand how matters stood that he ran away from the crowd, nobody paying any attention to what he did. Half an hour later, somebody cried out, "Look, there! Who's that? And what's he going to do?" pointing up the stream. Looking in that direction, the people saw someone 3/4 of a mile away standing on a floating field of ice in the river. He had a large farm basket strapped upon his shoulders, while in his hands he held a plank. As the ice field upon which he stood neared another, the youth ran forward, threw his plank down, making a bridge of it, and crossed to the farther field. Then, picking up his plank, he waited for a chance to repeat the process. As he thus drifted down the river, every eye was strained in his direction. Presently someone cried out, "It's Joe Lambert! And he's trying to cross to the island!" There was a shout as the people understood the nature of Joe's heroic attempt, and in a hush as its extreme danger became apparent. Joe had laid his plans wisely and well, but it seemed impossible that he could succeed. His purpose was, with the aid of the plank, to cross from one ice field to another until he should reach the island, but as that would require a good deal of time, and the ice was moving downstream pretty rapidly, it was necessary to start at a point above the town. Joe had gone about a mile up the river before going on the ice, and when first seen from the town he had already reached the channel. After that first shout, a whisper might have been heard in the crowd on the bank. The heroism of the poor boy's attempt awed the spectators. The momentary expectation that he would disappear forever amid the crushing ice fields made them hold their breath in anxiety and terror. His greatest danger was from the smaller cakes of ice. When it became necessary for him to step upon one of these, his weight was sufficient to make it tilt, and his footing was very insecure. After a while he was nearing the island. He came into a large collection of these smaller ice cakes. For a while he waited, hoping that a larger field would drift near him, but after a minute's delay he saw that he was rapidly floating past the island, and that he must either trust himself to the treacherous broken ice, or fail in his attempt to save the woman and child. Choosing the best of the floes, he laid his plank and passed across successfully. The cake tilted up, and Joe Lambert went down into the water. A shudder passed through the crowd on shore. "Poor fellow!" exclaimed some tender-hearted spectator. "It is all over with him now." "No, look, look!" shouted another. "He's trying to climb upon the ice! Hurrah! He's on his feet again!" With that, the whole company of spectators shouted for joy. Joe had managed to regain his plank as well as to climb upon a cake of ice before the fields around could crush him, and now, moving cautiously, he made his way little by little toward the island. "Hurrah! Hurrah! He's there at last!" shouted the people on the shore. "But will he get back again?" was the question each one asked himself a moment later. Having reached the island, Joe very well knew that the more difficult part of his task was still before him, for it was one thing for an active boy to work his way over floating ice, and quite another to carry a child and lead a woman upon a similar journey. But Joe Lambert was quick-witted and long-headed as well as brave, and he meant to do all that he could to save these poor creatures for whom he had risked his life so heroically. Taking out his knife, he made the woman cut her skirts off at the knees, so that she might walk and leap more freely. Then, placing the baby in the basket, which was strapped upon his back, he cautioned the woman against giving way to fright, and instructed her carefully about the method of crossing. On the return journey, Joe was able to avoid one great risk. As it was not necessary to land at any particular point, Time was of little consequence, and hence, when no large field of ice was at hand, he could wait for one to approach, without attempting to make use of the smaller ones. Leading the woman wherever that was necessary, he slowly made his way toward shore, drifting down the river, of course, while all the people of the town marched along the bank. When at last Joe leaped ashore in company with the woman, and bearing her babe in the basket on his back, the people seemed ready to trample upon each other in their eagerness to shake hands with their hero. Their hero was barely able to stand, however. Drenched as he had been in the icy water, the sharp March wind had chilled him to the marrow, and one of the village doctors speedily lifted him into his carriage, which he had bought for that purpose, and drove rapidly away, while the other physician took charge of Mrs. Martin and the baby. Joe was a strong, healthy fellow, and under the doctor's treatment of hot brandy and vigorous rubbing with coarse towels, he soon warmed. Then he wanted to saw enough wood for the doctor to pay for his treatment, and thereupon the doctor threatened to poison him if he should ever venture to mention pay to him again. Naturally enough, the village people talked of nothing but Joe Lambert's heroic deed, and the feeling was general that they had never done their duty toward the poor orphan boy. There was an eager wish to help him now, and many offers were made to him, but these all took the form of charity, and Joe would not accept charity at all. 4 years earlier, as I have already said, he had refused to go to the poorhouse or to be bound out, declaring that he could take care of himself. And when some thoughtless person had said in his hearing that he would have to live on charity, Joe's reply had been, "I'll never eat a mouthful in this town that I haven't worked for if I starve." And he had kept his word. Now that he was 15 years old, he was not willing to begin receiving charity, even in the form of a reward for his good deed. One day when some of the most prominent men of the village were talking to him on the subject, Joe said, "I don't want anything except a chance to work. But I'll tell you what you may do for me, if you will. Now that poor Martin is dead, the fairy privilege will be to lease again. I'd like to get it for a good long term. Maybe I can make something out of it by being always ready to row people across. And I may even be able to put on something better than a skiff after a while. I'll pay the village what Martin paid." The gentlemen were glad enough of a chance to do Joe even this small favor, and there was no difficulty in the way. The authorities gladly granted Joe a lease of the fairy privilege for 20 years, at $20 a year rent, which was the rate Martin had paid. At first, Joe rowed people back and forth, saving what money he got very carefully. This was all that could be required of him, but it occurred to Joe that if he had a ferry boat big enough, a good many horses and cattle, and a good deal of freight would be sent across the river, for he was a long-headed fellow, as I have said. One day a chance offered, and he bought for $25 a large old wood boat, which was simply a square barge, 40 feet long and 15 feet wide, with beveled bow and stern, made to hold cord wood for the steamboats. With his own hands he laid a stout deck on this, and with the assistance of a man whom he hired for that purpose, he constructed a pair of paddle wheels. By that time Joe was out of money, and work on the boat was suspended for a while. When he had accumulated a little more money, he bought a horse-power, and placed it in the middle of his boat, connecting it with the shaft of his wheels. Then he made a rudder and helm, and his horse-boat was ready for use. It had cost him about $100 beside his own labor upon it, but it would carry livestock and freight as well as passengers, and so the business of the ferry rapidly increased, and Joe began to put a little money away in the bank. After a while, a railroad was built into the village, and then a second one came. A year later, another railroad was opened on the other side of the river, and all the passengers who came to one village by rail had to be ferried across the river in order to continue their journey by the railroads there. The horse boat was too small and too slow for the business, and Joe Lambert had to buy 2 steam ferry boats to take its place. These cost more money than he had, but as the owner of the ferry privilege, his credit was good, and the boats soon paid for themselves, while Joe's bank account grew again. Finally, the railroad people determined to run through cars for passengers and freight, and to carry them across the river on large boats built for that purpose. But before they gave their orders to their boat builders, they were waited upon by the attorneys of Joe Lambert, who soon convinced them that his ferry privilege gave him alone the right to run any kind of ferry boats between the 2 villages, which had now grown to such size that they called themselves cities. The result was that the railroads made a contact with Joe to carry their cars across, and he had some large boats built for that purpose. All this occurred a good many years ago, and Joe Lambert is not called Joe now, but Captain Lambert. He is one of the most prosperous men in that little river city, and owns many large river steamers besides his ferry boats. Nobody is readier than he to help a poor boy or a poor man, but he has his own way of doing it. He will never toss so much as a cent to a beggar, but he never refuses to give man or boy a chance to earn money by work. He has an odd theory that money which comes without work does more harm than good. End of Joe Lambert's Ferry by George Carey Eggleston. Read by Little T.
The Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies by Beatrix Potter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sweet Pea. It is said that the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. I have never felt sleepy after eating lettuces, but then I am not a rabbit. They certainly had a very soporific effect upon the Flopsy Bunnies. When Benjamin Bunny grew up, he married his cousin Flopsy. They had a large family, and they were very improvident and cheerful. I do not remember the separate names of their children. They were generally called the Flopsy Bunnies. As there was not always quite enough to eat, Benjamin used to borrow cabbages from Flopsy's brother, Peter Rabbit, who kept a nursery garden. Sometimes Peter had no cabbages to spare. When this happened, the Flopsy Bunnies went across the field to a rubbish heap in the ditch outside Mr. McGregor's garden. Mr. McGregor's rubbish heap was a mixture. There were jam pots and paper bags, and mountains of chopped grass from the mowing machine, which always tasted oily, and some rotten vegetable marrows and an old boot or 2. One day, oh joy! There were a quantity of overgrown lettuces which had shot into flower. The Flopsy Bunnies simply stuffed lettuces. By degrees, one after another, they were so overcome with slumber, and lay down in the mown grass. Benjamin was not so much overcome as his children. Before going to sleep, he was sufficiently wide awake to put a paper bag over his head to keep off the flies. The little Flopsy Bunnies slept delightfully in the warm sun. From the lawn beyond the garden came the distant clackety sound of the mowing machine. The bluebottles buzzed about the wall, and a little old mouse picked over the rubbish among the jam pots. I can tell you her name. She was called Thomasina Tittlemouse, a wood mouse with a long tail. She rustled across the paper bag and awakened Benjamin Bunny. The mouse apologized profusely and said that she knew Peter Rabbit. Well, while she and Benjamin were talking close under the wall, they heard a heavy tread above their heads, and suddenly Mr. McGregor emptied out a sackful of lawn mowings right upon the top of the sleeping Flopsy Bunnies. Benjamin shrank down under his paper bag. The mouse hid in a jam pot. The little rabbits smiled sweetly in their sleep under the shower of grass. They did not awake because the lettuces had been so soporific. they dreamt that their mother Flopsy was tucking them up in a hay bed. Mr. McGregor looked down after emptying his sack. He saw some funny little brown tips of ears sticking up through the lawn mowings. He stared at them for some time. Presently a fly settled on one of them, and it moved. Mr. McGregor climbed down onto the rubbish heap. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said he, as he dropped them into his sack. The Flopsy Bunnies dreamt that their mother was turning them over in bed. They stirred a little in their sleep, but they did not wake up. Mr. McGregor tied up the sack and left it on the wall. He went to put away the mowing machine. While he was gone, Mrs. Flopsy Bunny, who had remained at home, came across the field. She looked suspiciously at the sack and wondered where everybody was. Then the mouse came out of her jam pot, and Benjamin took the paper bag off his head, and they told the doleful tale. Benjamin and Flopsy were in despair. They could not undo the string. But Mrs. Tittlemouse was a resourceful person. She nibbled a hole in the bottom corner of the sack. The little rabbits were pulled out and pinched to wake them. Their parents stuffed the empty sack with 3 rotten vegetable marrows, an old blacking brush, and 2 decayed turnips. Then they all hid under a bush and waited for Mr. McGregor. Mr. McGregor came back and picked up the sack and carried it off. He carried it hanging down as if it were rather heavy. The Flopsy Bunnies followed at a safe distance. They watched him go into his house, and then they crept up to the window to listen. Mr. McGregor threw down the sack on the stone floor in a way that would have been extremely painful to the Flopsy Bunnies if they had happened to be inside it. They could hear him drag his chair on the flags and chuckle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little rabbits, said Mr. McGregor. Eh, what's that? What have they been spoiling now? Inquired Mrs. McGregor. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 little fat rabbits, repeated Mr. McGregor, counting on his fingers. 1, 2, 3. Don't you be silly. What do you mean, you silly old man? In the sack. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, replied Mr. McGregor. The youngest Flopsy Bunny got up on the window-sill. Mrs. McGregor took hold of the sack and felt it. She said she could feel 6, but they must be old rabbits because they were so hard and all different shapes. Not fit to eat, but the skins will do fine to line my old cloak. Line your old cloak, shouted Mr. McGregor. I shall sell them and buy myself baccy. Rabbit tobacco. I shall skin them and cut off their heads. Mrs. McGregor untied the sack and put her hand inside. When she felt the vegetables, she became very angry. She said that Mr. McGregor had done it a purpose. And Mr. McGregor was very angry too. One of the rotten marrows came flying through the kitchen window and hit the youngest Flopsy Bunny. It was rather hurt. Then Benjamin and Flopsy thought that it was time to go home. So Mr. McGregor did not get his tobacco, and Mrs. McGregor did not get her rabbit skins. But next Christmas, Thomasina Tittlemouse got a present of enough rabbit wool to make herself a cloak and a hood, and a handsome muff and a pair of warm mittens. End of the Tale of the Flopsy Bunnies by Beatrix Potter. Read by Sweet Pea. The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Little Mermaid. Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as crystal, it is very, very deep. So deep indeed that no cable could fathom it. Many church steeples, piled one upon another, would not reach from the ground beneath to the surface of the water above. There dwell the Sea King and his subjects. We must not imagine that there is nothing at the bottom of the sea but bare yellow sand. No, indeed, the most singular flowers and plants grow there. the leaves and stems of which are so pliant that the slightest agitation of the water causes them to stir as if they had life. Fishes both large and small glide between the branches as birds fly among the trees here upon land. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral, and the long Gothic windows are of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl, which would be fit for the diadem of a queen. The Sea King had been a widower for many years, and his aged mother kept house for him. She was a very wise woman, and exceedingly proud of her high birth. On that account she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while others, also of high rank, were only allowed to wear 6. She was, however, deserving of very great praise, especially for her care of the little sea princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 beautiful children, but the youngest was the prettiest of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose leaf, and her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But like all others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they played in the great halls of the castle or among the living flowers that grew out of the walls. The large amber windows were open, and the fish swam in just like the swallows fly into our houses when we opened the windows, excepting that the fishes swam up to the princesses and ate out of their hands and allowed themselves to be stroked. Outside the castle there was a beautiful garden in which grew bright red and dark blue flowers and blossoms like flames or fire. The fruit glittered like gold, and the leaves and stems waved to and fro continually. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as the flame of burning sulphur. Over everything lay peculiar blue radiance, as if it were surrounded by the air from above, through which the blue sky shone, instead of the dark depths of the sea. In calm weather, the sun could be seen looking like a purple flower with the light streaming from the calyx. Each of the young princesses had a little plot of ground in the garden where she might dig and plant as she pleased. One arranged her flower bed into the form of a wheel. Another thought it better to make hers like the figure of a little mermaid. But that of the youngest was round like the sun and contained flowers as red as his rays at sunset. She was a strange child, quiet and thoughtful, and while her sisters would be delighted with the wonderful things which they obtained from wrecks of vessels, she cared for nothing but her pretty red flowers like the sun, excepting a beautiful marble statue. It was the representation of a handsome boy, carved out of pure white stone, which had fallen to the bottom of the sea from a wreck. She planted by the statue a rose-colored weeping willow. It grew splendidly, and very soon hung its fresh branches over the statue, almost down to the blue sands. The shadow had a violet tint, and waved to and fro like the branches. It seemed as if the crown of the tree and the root were at play and trying to kiss each other. Nothing gave her so much pleasure as to hear about the world above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her all she knew of the ships and of the towns, the people people and the animals. To her it seemed most wonderful and beautiful to hear that the flowers of the land should have fragrance, and not those below the sea, that the trees of the forest should be green, and that the fishes among the trees could sing so sweetly that it was quite a pleasure to hear them. Her grandmother called the little birds fishes, or she would not have understood her, for she had never seen birds. "When you have reached your 15th year," said the grandmother, "you will have permission to rise up out of the sea, to sit on the rocks in the moonlight while the great ships are sailing by, and then you will see both forests and towns." In the following year, one of the sisters would be 15, but as each was a year younger than the other, the youngest would have to wait 5 years before her turn came to rise up from the bottom of the ocean and see the earth as we do. However, each promised to tell the others what she saw on her first visit and what she thought the most beautiful, for their grandmother could not tell them enough. There were so many things on which they wanted information. None of them longed so much for her turn to come as the youngest, she who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many nights she stood by the open window, looking up through the dark blue water and watching the fish as they splashed about with their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars shining faintly, but through the water they looked larger than they do to our eyes. When something like a black cloud passed between her and them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming over her head or a ship full of human beings who never imagined that a pretty little mermaid was standing beneath them, holding out her white hands towards the keel of their ship. As soon as the eldest was 15, she was allowed to rise to the surface of the ocean. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to talk about. But the most beautiful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on a sandbank in the quiet sea near the coast and to gaze on a large town nearby, where the lights were twinkling like hundreds of stars, to listen to the sound of the music, the noise of the carriages, and the voices of human beings. And then to hear the merry bells peal out from the church steeples. And because she could not go near to all those wonderful things, she longed for them more than ever. Oh, did not the youngest sister listen eagerly to all these descriptions? And afterwards, when she stood at the open window looking up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all its bustle and noise, and even fancied she could hear the sound of the church bells down in the depths of the sea. In another year, the second sister received permission to rise to the surface of the water and to swim about where she pleased. She rose just as the sun was setting, and this, she said, was the most beautiful sight of all. The whole sky looked like gold, while violet and rose-colored clouds, which she could not describe, floated over her. And still more rapidly than the clouds flew a large flock of wild swans towards the setting sun, looking like a long white veil across the sea. She also swam towards the sun, but it sunk into the waves, and the rosy tints faded from the clouds and from the sea. The third sister's turn followed. She was the boldest of them all, and she swam up a broad river that emptied itself into the sea. On the banks she saw green hills covered with beautiful vines, palaces and castles peeped out from amid the proud trees of the forest. She heard the birds singing, and the rays of the sun were so powerful that she was obliged often to dive down under the water to cool her burning face. In a narrow creek, she found a whole troop of little human children, quite naked and sporting about in the water. She wanted to play with them, but they fled in great fright. And then a little black animal came to the water. It was a dog, but she did not know that, for she had never before seen one. This animal barked at her so terribly that she became frightened and rushed back to the open sea. But she said she should never forget the beautiful forest, the green hills, and the pretty little children who could swim in the water although they had no fish tails. The fourth sister was more timid. She remained in the midst of the sea, but she said it was quite as beautiful there as nearer the land. She could see for so many miles around her, and the sky above looked like a bell of glass. She said she had seen the ships, but at such a great distance that they looked like seagulls. The dolphins sported in the waves, and great whales spouted water from their nostrils, till it seemed as if 100 fountains were playing in every direction. The fifth sister's birthday occurred in the winter, so when her turn came, she saw what the others had not seen the first time they went up. The sea looked quite green, and large icebergs were floating about, each like a pearl, she said, but larger and loftier than the churches built by men. They were of the most singular shapes, and glittered like diamonds. She had seated herself upon one of the largest and let the wind play with her long hair, and she remarked that all the ships sailed by rapidly and steered as far away as they could from the iceberg, as if they were afraid of it. Towards evening, as the sun went down, dark clouds covered the sky. The thunder rolled and the lightning flashed, and the red light glowed on the icebergs as they rocked and tossed on the heaving sea. On all the ships the sails were reefed with fear and trembling, while she sat calmly on the floating iceberg, watching the blue lightning as it darted its forked flashes into the sea. When the first sisters had permission to rise to the surface, they were each delighted with the new and beautiful sights they saw. But now as grown-up girls they could go when they pleased, and they had become indifferent about it. They wished themselves back again in the water, and after a month had passed, they said it was much more beautiful down below and pleasanter to be at home. Yet often in the evening hours the 5 sisters would twine their arms round each other and rise to the surface in a row. They had more beautiful voices than any human being could have, and before the approach of a storm, and when they expected a ship would be lost, they swam before the vessel and sang sweetly of the delights to be found in the depths of the sea, and begging the sailors not to fear if they sank to the bottom. But the sailors could not understand the song. They took it for the howling of the storm, and these things were never to be beautiful for them. For if the ship sank, the men were drowned, and their dead bodies alone reached the palace of the Sea King. When the sisters rose arm in arm through the water in this way, the youngest sister would stand quite alone, looking after them, ready to cry. Only that the mermaids have no tears, and therefore they suffer more. Oh, were I but 15 years old, she said, I know that I shall love the world up there, and all the people who live in it. At last she reached her 15th year. Well, now you are grown up, said the old dowager, her grandmother,
so you must let me adorn you like your other sisters." And she placed a wreath of white lilies in her hair, and every flower leaf was half a pearl. Then the old lady ordered 8 great oysters to attach themselves to the tail of the princess to show her high rank. "But they hurt me so," said the little mermaid. "Pride must suffer pain," replied the old lady. Oh, how gladly she would have shaken off this grandeur and laid aside the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her own garden would have suited her much better, but she could not help herself. So she said farewell and rose as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set as she raised her head above the waves, but the clouds were tinted with crimson and gold, and through the glimmering twilight beamed the evening star in all its beauty. The sea was calm and the air mild and fresh. A large ship with 3 masts lay becalmed on the water, with only 1 sail set, for not a breeze stifted, and the sailors sat idle on deck or amongst the rigging. There was music and song on board, and as darkness came on, 100 colored lanterns were lit as if the flags of all nations waved in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows, and now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through the clear glass window panes and see a number of well-dressed people within. Among them was a young prince, the most beautiful of all, with large black eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was being kept with much rejoicing. The sailors were dancing on deck, but when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose in the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was so startled that she dived under water, and when she again stretched out her head, it appeared as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She had never seen such fireworks before. Great suns spurted fire about. Splendid fireflies flew into the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea beneath. The ship itself was so brightly illuminated that all the people, and even the smallest rope, could be distinctly and plainly seen. And how handsome the young prince looked, as he pressed the hands of all present and smiled at them, while the music resounded through the clear night air. It was very late, yet the little mermaid could not take her eyes from the ship, or from the beautiful prince. The colored lanterns had been extinguished. No more rockets rose in the air, and the cannon had ceased firing. But the sea became restless, and a moaning, grumbling sound could be heard beneath the waves. Still the little mermaid remained by the cabin window, rocking up and down on the water, which enabled her to look in. After a while, the sails were quickly unfurled, and the noble ship continued her passage. But soon the waves rose higher, and heavy clouds darkened the sky, and lightning appeared in the distance. A dreadful storm was approaching. Once more the sails were reefed, and the great ship pursued her flying course over the raging sea. The waves rose mountains high, as if they would have overtopped the mast, but the ship dived like a swan between them, and then rose again under lofty foaming crests. To the little mermaid this appeared pleasant sport. Not so to the sailors. At length the ship groaned and creaked. The thick planks gave way under the lashing of the sea. As it broke over the deck, The mainmast snapped as under like a reed the ship lay over on her side, and the water rushed in. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she herself was obliged to be careful, to avoid the beams and planks of the wreck, which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was so pitch dark that she could not see a single object, but a flash of lightning revealed the whole scene. She could see everyone who had been on board, excepting the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves, and she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. And then she remembered that human beings could not live in the water, so that when he got down to her father's palace, he would be quite dead. But he must not die, so she swam about among the beams and planks which strewed the surface of the sea, forgetting that they could crush her to pieces. Then she dived deeply under the dark waters, rising and falling with the waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince, who was fast losing the power of swimming in that stormy sea. His limbs were failing him, his beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died had not the little mermaid come to his assistance. She held his head above the water and let the waves drift them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red and glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the hue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high, smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in her little garden, and she kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently they came in sight of land. She saw lofty blue mountains on which the white snow rested, as if a flock of swans were lying upon them. Near the coast were beautiful green forests, and close by stood a large building, whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite still, but very deep, so she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to raise his head higher than his body. Then bells sounded in the large white building, and a number of young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out farther from the shore, and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea so that her little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw the prince came to life again, and smiled upon those who stood round him, but to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her very unhappy, and when he was led away into the great building, she dived down sorrowfully into the water, and returned to her father's castle. She had always been silent and thoughtful, and now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had seen during her first visit to the surface of the water, but she would tell them nothing. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she had left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen till they were gathered, and the snow on the tops of the mountains melt away, but she never saw the prince, and therefore she returned home always more sorrowful than before. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arm round the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince. But she gave up tending her flowers, and they grew in wild confusion over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems round the branches of the trees, so that the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer, and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known to two mermaids whose intimate friend happened to know who the prince was. She also had seen the festival on board the ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses. Then they entwined their arms and rose up in a long row to the surface of the water, close by the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow shining stone, with long flights of marble steps, one of which reached quite down to the sea. Splendid gilded cupolas rose over the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood lifelike statues of marble. Through the clear crystal of the lofty windows could be seen noble rooms with costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry, while the walls were covered with beautiful paintings which were a pleasure to look at. In the center of the largest saloon, a fountain threw its sparkling jets high up into the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants growing round the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where he lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim much nearer to the shore than any of the others ventured to do. Indeed, when she went quite up the narrow channel under the marble balcony which threw a broad shadow on the water, here she would sit and watch the young prince, who thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. She saw him many times of an evening sailing in a pleasant boat with music playing and flags waving. She peeped out from among the green rushes, and if the wind caught her long silvery white veil, those who saw it believed it to be a swan spreading out its wings. On many a night, too, when the fishermen with their torches were out at sea, she heard them relate so many good things about the doings of the young prince that she was glad she had saved his life when he had been tossed about half dead on the waves. And she remembered that his head had rested on her bosom, and how heartily she had kissed him. But he knew nothing of all this, and could not even dream of her. She grew more and more fond of human beings, and wished more and more to be able to wander about with those whose world seemed so much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in ships, and mount the high hills which were far above the clouds, and the lands they possessed, their woods and their fields, stretched far away beyond the reach of her sight. There was so much that she wished to know, and her sisters were unable to answer all her questions. Then she applied to her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she very rightly called the lands above the sea. "If human beings are not drowned," asked the little mermaid, "can they live forever? Do they never die as we do here in the sea?" "Yes," replied the old lady, "they must also die, and their term of life is even shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years. But when we cease to exist here, we only become the foam on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here of those who we love. We have no immortal souls. We shall never live again, but like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned into dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air, beyond the glittering stars. As we rise out of the water and behold all the land of the earth, so do they rise to unknown and glorious regions which we shall never see." "Why have not we an immortal soul?" asked the little mermaid mournfully. "I would give gladly the hundreds of years that I have to live to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of the glorious world above the stars." "You must not think of that," said the old woman. "We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings." "So I shall die," said the little mermaid, "and as the foam of the sea, I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul?" "No," said the old woman, "unless a man were to love you so much that you were more to him than his father or mother, and if all his thoughts and his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and hereafter, then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give a soul to you, and retain his own as well. But this can never happen. Your fish's tail, which amongst us is considered so beautiful, is thought on earth to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it necessary to have 2 stout props, which they call legs, in order to be handsome." Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowfully at her fish's tail. "Let us be happy," said the old lady, "and dart and spring about during the 300 years that we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we are going to have a court ball. It is one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth. The walls and the ceiling of the large ballroom were of thick but transparent crystal. Many hundreds of colossal shells, some of a deep red, others of a grass green, stood on each side in rows, with blue fire in them, which lit up the whole saloon and shone through the walls, so that the sea was also illuminated. Innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past the crystal walls. On some of them the scales glowed with a purple brilliancy, and on others they shone like silver and gold. Through the halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermaid and the mermaids, to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such a lovely voice as theirs. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than them all. The whole court applauded with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the loveliest voice of any on earth or in the sea. But she soon thought again of the world above her, for she could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she had not an immortal soul like his. Therefore she crept away silently out of her father's palace, and while everything within was gladness and song, she sat in her own little garden sorrowfully and alone. Then she heard the bugle sounding through the water, and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes depend, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will venture all for him, and win an immortal soul, while my sisters are dancing in my father's palace. I will go to the sea witch, of whom I have always been so much afraid, but she can give me counsel and help." And then the little mermaid went out from her garden and took the road to the foaming whirlpools, behind which the sorceress lived. She had never been that way before. Neither flowers nor grass grew there. Nothing but bare gray sandy ground stretched out to the whirlpool, where the water like foaming mill wheels whirled round everything that it seized and cast into the fathomless deep. Through the midst of these crushing whirlpools, the little mermaid was obliged to pass to reach the dominions of the sea witch. And also for a long distance, the only road lay right across a quantity of warm bubbling mire, called by the witch her turf moor. Beyond this stood her house, in the center of a strange forest, in which all the trees and flowers were polypi, half animals and half plants. They looked like serpents with 100 heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like flexible worms, moving limb after limb from the root to the top. All that could be reached in the sea they seized upon and held fast so that it never escaped from their clutches. The little mermaid was so alarmed at what she saw that she stood still, and her heart beat with fear. And she was very nearly turning back, but she thought of the prince and of a human soul for which she longed, and her courage returned. She fastened her long flowing hair round her head so that the polypi might not seize hold of it. She laid her hands together across her bosom, and then she darted forward as a fish shoots through the water, between the supple arms and fingers of the ugly polypi, which were stretched out on either side of her. She saw that each held in its grasp something it had seized with its numerous little arms, as if they were iron bands, the white skeletons of human beings who had perished at sea and had sunk down into the deep waters, skeletons of land animals, oars, rudders, and chests of ships, were lying tightly grasped by their clinging arms. Even a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled, and this seemed the most shocking of all to the little princess. She now came to a space of marshy ground in the wood, where large fat water snakes were rolling in the mire and showing their ugly drab-colored bodies. In the midst of this spot stood a house built with the bones of shipwrecked human beings. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as people sometimes feed a canary with a piece of sugar. She called the ugly water snakes her little chickens and allowed them to crawl all over her bosom. "I know what you want," said the sea witch. "It is very stupid of you, but you shall have your way, and it will bring you to sorrow, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail and have 2 supports instead of it, like human beings on earth, so that the young prince may fall in love with you, and that you may have an immortal soul." And then the witch laughed so loud and disgustingly that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground and lay there wriggling about. "You are but just in time," said the witch, "for after sunrise tomorrow I should not be able to help you till the end of another year. I will prepare a draught for you, with which you must swim to land tomorrow before sunrise, and sit down on the shore and drink it. Your tail will disappear and shrink up into what mankind calls legs, and you will feel great pain, as if a sword were passing through you. But all who see you will say that you are the prettiest little human being they ever saw. You will still have the same floating gracefulness of movement, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly, but at every step you take it will feel as if you are treading upon sharp knives, and that the blood must flow. If you will bear all this, I will help you." "Yes, I will," said the little princess in a trembling voice as she thought of the prince and the immortal soul. "But think again," said the witch, "for when once your shape has become like a human being, you can no more be a mermaid. You will never return through the water to your sisters or your father's palace again. And if you do not win the love of the prince so that he is willing to forget his father and mother for your sake and to love you with his whole soul and allow the priest to join your hands that you may be man and wife, then you will never have an immortal soul. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break, and you will become foam on the crests of the waves." "I will do it," said the little mermaid, and she became pale as death. "But I must be paid also," said the witch, "and it is not a trifle that I ask. You have the sweetest voice of any who dwell here in the depths of the sea, and you believe that you will be able to charm the prince with it also. But this voice you must give me, the best thing you possess, will I have for the price of my draught. My own blood must be mixed with it, that it may be as sharp as a 2-edged sword." "But if you take away my voice," said the little mermaid, "what is left for me? Your beautiful form, your graceful walk, and your expressive eyes. Surely with these you can enchain a man's heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue, that I may cut it off as my payment. Then you shall have the powerful draught." "It shall be," said the little mermaid. Then the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to prepare the magic draught. "Cleanliness is a good thing," said she, scouring the vessel with snakes which she had tied together in a large knot. Then she pricked herself in the breast and let the black blood drop into it. The steam that rose formed itself into such horrible shapes that no one could look at them without fear. Every moment the witch threw something else into the vessel, and when it began to boil, The sound was like the weeping of a crocodile. When at last the magic draft was ready, it looked like the clearest water. "There it is for you," said the witch. Then she cut off the mermaid's tongue so that she became dumb and would never again speak or sing. "If the polypi should seize hold of you as you return through the wood," said the witch, "throw over them a few drops of the potion, and their fingers will be torn into 1,000 pieces." But the little mermaid had no occasion to do this, for the polypi sprang back in terror when they caught sight of the glittering draught which shone in her hand like a twinkling star. So she passed quickly through the wood and the marsh and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw that in her father's palace the torches in the ballroom were extinguished and all within asleep. But she did not venture to go in to them, for she knew she was dumb and going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart would break. She stole into the garden, took a flower from the flower beds of each of her sisters, kissed her hand 1,000 times towards the palace, and then rose up through the dark blue waters. The sun had not risen when she came in sight of the prince's palace and approached the beautiful marble steps, but the moon shone clear and bright. Then the little mermaid drank the magic draught, and it seemed as if a two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fell into a swoon and lay like one dead. When the sun arose and shone over the sea, she recovered and felt a sharp pain. But just before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his coal-black eyes upon her so earnestly that she cast down her own, and then became aware that her fish tail was gone, and that she had a pretty pair of white legs and tiny feet, as any little maiden could have. But she had no clothes, so she wrapped herself in her long, thick hair. The prince asked her who she was and where she came from, and she looked at him mildly and sorrowfully with her deep blue eyes, but she could not speak. Every step she took was as the witch had said it would be. She felt as if treading upon the points of needles or sharp knives, but she bore it willingly and stepped as lightly by the prince's side as a soap bubble, so that he and all who saw her wondered at her graceful swaying movements. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, and was the most beautiful creature in the palace. But she was dumb, and could neither speak nor sing. Beautiful female slaves, dressed in silk and gold, stepped forward and sang before the prince and his royal parents. One sang better than all the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This was great sorrow to the little mermaid. She knew how much more sweetly she herself could sing once, and she thought, "Oh, if he could only know that! I have given away my voice forever to be with him." The slaves next performed some pretty fairy-like dances to the sound of beautiful music. Then the little mermaid raised her lovely white arms, stood on the tips of her toes, and glided over the floor, and danced as no one yet had been able to dance. At each moment her beauty became more revealed, and her expressive eyes appealed more directly to the heart than the songs of the slaves. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling, and she danced again quite readily to please him. though each time her foot touched the floor, it seemed as if she trod on sharp knives. The prince said she should remain with him always, and she received permission to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion. He had a page's dress made for her, that she might accompany him on horseback. They rode together through the sweet-scented woods, where the green boughs touched their shoulders, and the little birds sang among the fresh leaves. She climbed with the prince to the tops of high mountains, and although her tender feet bled so that even her steps were marked, she only laughed and followed him till they could see the clouds beneath them, looking like a flock of birds traveling to the distant lands. While at the prince's palace, and when all the household were asleep, she would go and sit on the broad marble steps, for it eased her burning feet to bathe them in the cold sea water, and she thought of all those below in the deep. Once during the night, her sisters came up arm in arm, singing sorrowfully. As they floated on the water, she beckoned to them, and they recognized her, and told her how she had grieved them. After that, they came to the same place every night. And once she saw in the distance her old grandmother, who had not been to the surface of the sea for many years, and the old sea king, her father, with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but they did not venture so near the land as her sisters did. As the days passed, she loved the prince more fondly, and he loved her as he would love a little child. But it never came into his head to make her his wife. Yet, unless he married her, she could not receive an immortal soul. And the morning after his marriage with another, she would dissolve into the foam of the sea. "Do you not love me, the best of them all?" the eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say, when he took her in his arms and kissed her fair forehead. "Yes, you are dear to me," said the prince, "for you have the best heart, and you are the most devoted to me. You are like a young maiden whom I once saw, but whom I shall never meet again. I was in a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple, where several young maidens performed the service. The youngest of them found me on the shore and saved my life. I saw her but twice, and she is the only one in the world whom I could love. But you are like her, and you have almost driven her image out of my mind. She belongs to the holy temple, and my good fortune has sent you to me instead of her, and we will never part." "Ah, he knows not that it was I who saved his life," thought the little mermaid. "I carried him over the sea to the wood where the temple stands. I sat beneath the foam and watched till the human beings came to help him. I saw the pretty maiden that he loves better than he loves me," and the mermaid sighed deeply, but she could not shed tears. "He says the maiden belongs to the holy temple. Therefore, she will never return to the world. They will meet no more while I am by his side and see him every day. I will take care of him and love him and give up my life for his sake." Very soon it was said that the prince must marry, and the beautiful daughter of a neighboring king would be his wife, for a fine ship was being fitted out. Although the prince gave out that he merely intended to pay a visit to the king. It was generally supposed that he really went to see his daughter. A great company were to go with him. The little mermaid smiled and shook her head. She knew the prince's thoughts better than any of the others. "I must travel," he said to her. "I must see this beautiful princess. My parents desire it, but they will not oblige me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She is not like the beautiful maiden in the temple whom you resemble. If I were forced to choose a bride, I would rather choose you, my dumb foundling, with those expressive eyes." And then he kissed her rosy mouth, played with her long wavy hair, and laid his head on her heart, while she dreamed of human happiness and an immortal soul. "You're not afraid of the sea, my dumb child," said he, as they stood on deck of the noble ship, which was to carry them to the country of the neighboring king. And then he told her of the storm, and of the calm, of the strange fishes in the deep beneath them, and of what the divers had seen there. And she smiled at his descriptions, for she knew better than anyone what wonders were at the bottom of the sea. In the moonlight, when all on board were asleep excepting the man at the helm who was steering, she sat on the deck gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could distinguish her father's castle, and upon it her aged grandmother with the silver crown on her head, looking through the rushing tide at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up on the waves and gazed at her mournfully, wringing their white hands. She beckoned to them and smiled and wanted to tell them how happy and well off she was. But the cabin boy approached, and when her sisters dived down, he thought it was only the foam of the sea which he saw. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbor of a beautiful town belonging to the king whom the prince was going to visit. The church bells were ringing, and from the high towers sounded a flourish of trumpets, and soldiers with flying colors and glittering bayonets lined the rocks through which they passed. Every day was a festival. Balls and entertainments followed one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. People said that she was being brought up and educated in a religious house where she was learning every royal virtue. At last she came. Then the little mermaid, who was very anxious to see whether she was really beautiful, was obliged to acknowledge that she had never seen a more perfect vision of beauty. Her skin was delicately fair, and beneath her long dark eyelashes, her laughing blue eyes shone with truth and purity. "It was you," said the prince, "who saved my life when I lay dead on the beach," and he folded his blushing bride in his arms. "Oh, I am too happy," said he to the little mermaid. "My fondest hopes are fulfilled. You will rejoice at my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere." The little mermaid kissed his hand, and felt as if her heart were already broken. His wedding morning would bring death to her, and she would change into foam of the sea. All the church bells rung, and the heralds rode about town proclaiming the betrothal. Perfumed oil was burning in costly silver lamps on every altar. The priests waved the censers while the bride and bridegroom joined their hands and received the blessing of the bishop. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held up the bride's train. But her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eyes saw not the holy ceremony. She thought of the night of death, which was coming to her, and of all she had lost in the world. On the same evening, the bride and bridegroom went on board ship. Cannons were roaring, flags waving, and in the center of the ship a costly tent of purple and gold had been erected. It contained elegant couches for the reception of the bridal pair during the night. The ship, with the swelling sails and favorable wind, glided away smoothly and lightly over the calm sea. When it grew dark, a number of colored lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of her first rising out of the sea, when she had seen similar festivities and joys, and she joined in the dance, poised herself in the air as a swallow when he pursues his prey, and all present cheered her with wonder. She had never danced so elegantly before. Her tender feet felt as if cut with sharp knives, but she cared not for it. A sharper pain had pierced through her heart. She knew this was the last evening she should ever see the prince for whom she had forsaken her kindred and home. She had given up her beautiful voice and suffered unheard of pain daily for him, while he knew nothing of it. This was the last evening that she would breathe the same air with him, or gaze on the starry sky and the deep sea. In eternal night, without a thought or a dream, awaited her. She had no soul, and now she could never win one. All was joy and gaiety on board ship, till long after midnight. She laughed and danced with the rest, while the thoughts of death were in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, while she played with his raven hair, till they went arm in arm to rest in the splendid tent. Then all became still on board the ship. The helmsman, alone awake, stood at the helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel, and looked towards the east for the first blush of morning, for that first ray of dawn that would bring her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. They were as pale as herself, but their long, beautiful hair waved no more in the wind. It had been cut off. "We have given our hair to the witch," said they, "to obtain help for you, that you may not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again and form into a fish's tail, and you will be once more a mermaid, and return to us to live out your 300 years before you die and change into the salt sea foam. Haste, then. He or you must die before the sun rise. Our old grandmother moans so for you, that her white hair is falling off from sorrow, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hasten. Do you not see the first red streaks in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise, and you must die." And then they sighed deeply and mournfully, and sank down beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent, and beheld the fair bride with her head resting on the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his fair brow. then looked at the sky, on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. Then she glanced at the sharp knife, and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who whispered the name of his bride in his dreams. She was in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in her hand. She flung it far away from her, into the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted up looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and his warm rays fell on the cold foam of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun, and all around her floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, as they were also unseen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and her voice sounded ethereal as the voices of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. "Among the daughters of the air," answered one of them. "A mermaid has not an immortal soul, or can she obtain one unless she wins the love of a human being. On the power of another hangs her eternal destiny. But the daughters of the air, although they do not possess an immortal soul, can by their good deeds procure one for themselves. We fly to warm countries and cool the sultry air that destroys mankind with the pestilence. We carry the perfume of the flowers to spread health and restoration. After we have striven for 300 years to all the good in our power, we receive an immortal soul and take part in the happiness of mankind. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do as we are doing, but you have suffered and endured and raised yourself to the spirit world by your good deeds. And now, by striving for 300 years in the same way, you may obtain an immortal soul." The little mermaid lifted her glorified eyes towards the sun and felt them for the first time filling with tears. On the ship in which she had left the prince, there were life and noise. She saw him and his beautiful bride searching for her. Sorrowfully they gazed at the pearly foam as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the forehead of the bride and fanned the prince, and then mounted with the other children of the air a rosy cloud that floated through the ether. "After 300 years, thus shall we float into the kingdom of heaven," said she, "and we may even get there sooner," whispered one of her companions. "Unseen, we can't enter the houses of men where there are children, and for every day in which we find a good child who is the joy of his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened. The child doesn't know when we fly through the room that we smile with joy at his good conduct, for we can count 1 year less of the 300 years. But when we see a naughty or wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow, and for every tear, a day is added to our time of trial." End of The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Read by Leilani Cass.